second talk by Tenzin Wangmo. So now, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Catrin Misselhorn. She is our first speaker. She is full professor of philosophy at the University of Göttingen. And from 2012 until 2019, she was chair for the philosophy of science and technology at the University of Stuttgart. Before, she held positions at the Humboldt University in Berlin, the University of Zurich, and the University of Tübingen. And from 2007 to 2008, she was Theodor Leinen Research Fellow at the Center of Affective Sciences in Geneva, at the Collège de France, and the Institut Jean Nicot for Cognitive Science in Paris. Her main research areas are philosophical problems in AI, robot and machine ethics, and I assume this is exactly the point where this talk will be about. Catrin Misselhorn, I give the stage to you.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to speak about the question artificial systems with moral capacities, theoretical foundations, and a roadmap for a geriatric care system. I have been working on this topic for quite a while. So far, dementia hasn't been a focus of this work, but I hope to see whether it extends to dementia. So, artificial morality, that's an emerging field in the area of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has the aim to model and simulate human cognitive abilities, and artificial morality more specifically explores whether and how artificial systems can be furnished with moral capacities. And machine ethics then provides the theoretical and ethical framework for thinking about artificial morality. So I think it is important to think about these issues because artificial morality will have a deep impact on our lives in many areas. Think about autonomous driving, elder care, but also war. So artificial morality becomes an issue because the development of increasingly intelligent and autonomous technologies will eventually lead to these systems having to face morally problematic situations. And in these situations, the systems cannot be fully controlled by human operators anymore because that would deprive them of the advantages that they have as autonomous systems. In many areas of application, we want autonomous systems to operate independently of human control. Think about a vacuum cleaning robot, for instance. And to sort of guarantee that they will act properly in these morally relevant situations, they have to be furnished with moral capacities. So the goal of my talk is to provide the theoretical foundations for implementing moral capacities in artificial systems in general and to develop a roadmap for constructing an artificial system for geriatric care, a software module to be more precise. So I will investigate the issues that are crucial for delineating the possibility and scope of artificial morality and develop some strategies how to proceed when trying to implement moral capacities in elder care systems. So this area of application was chosen because artificial morality cannot just be discussed in the abstract, but must be seen in relation to a certain context of application. So elder care is, of course, a highly relevant area of application because of the shortage of caregivers that is becoming a growing because of this, there is becoming a growing interest in autonomous assistive systems that can be used in geriatric care. The first step of the talk is to explain what moral capacities are. So it will be assumed that moral capacities are distinctive of moral agents, and the relevant capacities of moral agents will be elaborated, and it will be shown that artificial agents can be moral agents. In the second part of the talk, different levels and directions of explanations are distinguished, which are important in this project. So this is necessary in order to understand how one has to go about when trying to build an artificial system with moral capacities. And since such a project requires a genuinely interdisciplinary research design for artificial morality, it is, of course, indispensable to think about the way in which different disciplines are working together. The third part of the talk is then dedicated to different approaches to moral implementation. And these approaches are instantiations of the general research design described in the second part. So as will become apparent, it depends on the purpose and the context a system is designed for, which approach to moral implementation one should choose. So in the fourth section, I will show that a hybrid approach is most apt for the area of geriatric care. And the aim of this section is not really to achieve the construction of an artificial system with moral capacities, but to develop a research design. So it provides or outlines a roadmap with the steps that have to be taken in order to build a software module for a geriatric care robot with moral capacities. So let me start with the first part. I assume that moral capacities are what makes people moral agents, and talk of the implementation of moral capacities in artificial systems therefore presupposes that they can be moral agents too, in a certain sense, and that's of course not a trivial assumption. So in order to justify this claim, one has to answer two questions. The first one concerning agency in general, so there have to be criteria developed that have to be met by something to qualify as an agent. And it has to be shown that at least some artificial systems fulfill these criteria. The second question is then what makes an artificial agent a moral agent, and whether artificial systems cannot just be agents, but moral agents. So two dimensions have been considered relevant for agency in philosophy. The first one is that agents are, in some sense, I call this self-originating sources of their doings. So why am I using this term? In English, maybe autonomous is a little less demanding than in German. In German, there's autonomy tied very much to the Kantian tradition that really has a very high or demanding level of the capacities required. Sort of to distinguish my approach from this account, I'm speaking of self-originating sources of their doings. In the discussion, this condition is formulated in different ways, for instance, by saying that actions may not be determined by external factors, involve some sort of flexibility, or are under the control of the agent, so in a very general way. And the second dimension that being an agent involves is the capacity to act for reasons. So the term dimensions is supposed to suggest that these characteristics are gradual, so an agent may possess them to a higher or lower degree. In its most demanding form, the concept of self-origination is understood metaphysically as agent causation, in the sense that an action is initiated by the agent without any prior cause. But I think one does not have to commit to such a strong view. There are less demanding criteria for self-origination, which may also be fulfilled in principle by some artificial systems. First thing is they're able to interact with the environment. Secondly, they're able to change state without there being an external stimulus. That is, they possess some form of basic independence from human. And thirdly, some artificial systems have the capacity to adapt their behavior to new situations. So self-origination is not the only dimension of agency. The other one is the capacity to act for reasons. Whether an artificial system can do this depends on its capacity to process information. So according to the classical Jungian model of action explanation, a reason for an action consists in a combination of two attitudes, a belief and a pro-attitude, for example, a desire. I'm going to the library, that's my action, because I want to borrow a book, that's the pro-attitude, and I believe that the library has got it, that's my belief. So beliefs and pro-attitudes can be analyzed as symbolic representations of states of affairs, which are either given to the system as a fact or as something that ought to be brought about. So these symbolic representations can be stored in memory and accessed when necessary, and they play a causal role in the production of behavior. So this is, from my point of view, enough to say that they can act for reasons if they have such kind of representations, how things are, how they ought to be, and how to bring about a match between the two states, that is, to adapt how the world is to the way it is supposed to be. So if a system possesses representational states which have an analogous function for the system as the corresponding mental states have in use in humans, the system may be called functionally equivalent to a human agent in this respect. So let me come now to my second question, or sort of to summarize, some artificial systems may be functionally equivalent to human agents if they possess a sufficient high degree of interactivity, independence, and adaptability, and if they're able to act for reasons in the information processing sense that I just described. So let me come to the second question. When is an artificial agent or can be considered as a moral agent? So I think self-origination, that's the same thing as before. But the difference is that they have to act for moral reasons. That is, they have to be states that are functionally equivalent to moral beliefs and moral and attitudes, as well as information processing mechanisms that prompt the system to change the world if it is not the way it should be from a moral point of view. If a system adopts, for instance, in the context of care, a positive pro-attitude with respect to the moral value of the autonomy of the care-dependent person, and comes to the belief that it is threatened in a certain situation, then it will try to change the situation in such a way that the person's autonomy is re-established. So this reasoning involves a moral judgment. Such a system, that's my claim, can act for moral reasons in a functional sense. The nature of the relevant moral reasons is, however, highly dependent on the context of application of such a system. And this is what we'll see in the section with the proposal for a geriatric care system with moral capacities. So one has to be aware, though, that this functional form of moral agency, which artificial systems may display, does not yet amount to full moral agency as it pertains to human beings. Here you see a picture from Wendell Wallach and Colin Allen's seminal book, Moral Machines, and they discriminate between different levels of moral agency along to two independent dimensions. They call it autonomy on the one hand and ethical sensitivity. So autonomy, that comes close to what I've been calling self-origination, but ethical sensitivity can occur already below the level of acting for reasons. So a simple tool like a hammer, for instance, does neither possess autonomy nor ethical sensitivity. So its use is entirely up to the user. It can either use it to hammer a nail or to beat somebody's skull. So no autonomy, no ethical sensitivity. In contrast to this, a child safety lock, for instance, does involve a certain ethical sensitivity despite lacking autonomy. So in its hardware and use is implemented the value of protecting children, but it is in no way autonomous. So its ethical sensitivity is still owed entirely to the designer and user of the object. This is why Wallach and Allen call this operational morality. The level that's relevant for our topic is functional morality, which requires, from my point of view, functional moral agency in the sense explained above. So a system that possesses functional morality operates on symbolic representations, which are functionally equivalent to moral beliefs and attitudes. Yet, such a system does not yet attain full moral agency as humans do. So full moral agency involves not just having moral beliefs and attitudes. It presumably requires consciousness, free will, and the capacity to make moral attitudes themselves the object of reflection and justification. The restriction to functional morality has the advantage that one can avoid the notorious question whether artificial systems may have consciousness or not. So let me come to the next part. To see how one has to proceed when trying to implement moral capacities in artificial systems, it's necessary to distinguish between different levels and directions of explanation. So the idea that there are different levels of explanation stems from the philosophy of mind, and it's well established in cognitive science. It was, of course, introduced to the debate by Daniel Dennett, and he distinguishes three stances: the intentional stance at the top of the explanatory level, the design stance in the middle, and the physical stance at the bottom here. If we adopt the intentional stance, a system is considered as a rational agent that is acting for reasons, so its behavior is explained along the lines of the human model of action explanation by ascribing beliefs and attitudes, which are called intentional states, of course. So when we explain the behavior of an object from the design stance, we assume that the entity in question has been designed in a certain way and that it will thus behave as designed. So every time you drive a car, you assume that the engine will start when you turn the key, and you probably make this assumption from the design stance. That is, you assume that the engine will start when you turn the key because that's how the car has been designed to function. And the physical stance, finally, is the perspective of the physical sciences to explain the behavior of a given entity. According to the physical stance, we use information about its physical constitution in conjunction with information about the laws of physics. So suppose I'm holding a piece of chalk in my hand, which is falling to the floor. When I release it, the explanation of this event relies on the fact that the piece of chalk has mass and weight and the law of gravity. The distinction of these levels of explanation leads quite naturally to the distinction of different explanatory direction between these stances. So the explanatory direction is horizontal if the explanation remains at the same explanatory level, that is, intentionally described behavior is explained with the help of intentional states. And the explanatory direction is vertical if a datum which is given in terms of one explanatory level is explained by referring to a lower explanatory level. For instance, intentionally described behavior is explained in functional or physical terms. So our ordinary moral explanations usually stay at the intentional level. We may, for instance, explain Anna speaking up for her sister by the fact that she believes that her sister was offended and wants to help her. When thinking about moral capacities, however, one has to change explanatory levels and look for a vertical explanation of moral behavior at the design level. And one consequence of this change of explanatory levels is that one is switching from a personal to a subpersonal point of view. So more precisely, one is mainly moving between the intentional and the design level. So one might, of course, also look for a physical explanation of moral behavior, for example, by looking at the physical structures of the brain. Yet the physical level is not of much theoretical interest for the implementation of moral capacities in artificial systems. What makes this attempt, apart from the practical need, theoretically thrilling, is the hope to find common structures of moral capacities at the design level, which may be implemented in different kinds of stuff, for instance, the human body or artificial systems. So corresponding to the different levels of explanation are different levels of information processing. Following David Ma's influential work on the functioning of the visual system, one can distinguish between the computational level, the algorithmic level, and the hardware level. At the computational level, one has to find a general description of a cognitive task and translate it into a specific information processing problem. So the analysis must specify the kind of input with which the cognitive system starts, the way how the information is processed, and the output, which will be produced by the system. At the algorithmic level, a detailed set of information processing routines has to be defined, which can serve to solve the information processing problem described at the computational level. So one has to spell out which representational form the input and output takes and what the algorithms for the transformations are. And research at the hardware level will finally answer the question of how the representational states and the algorithms are physically realized. So as a genuinely interdisciplinary research designed for artificial morality at the interface of philosophy and computer science, this will then have to take on the following shape. So we as philosophers describe a description of moral behavior at the intentional level and try together with computer scientists to translate it into a complex information processing problem. And the computer scientists then have to specify the information processing routines which are necessary to solve this complex problem at the algorithmic level. So failures at each step of this process will result in questioning, of course, the outcomes of the previous steps as well. And the research design, therefore, has to involve a feedback loop, which is responsible for a dynamic and partly self-correcting development of the theoretical hypothesis, which are then fed into developing this system. In the debate about the implementation of moral capacities in artificial systems, one distinguishes then between top-down, bottom-up, and hybrid approaches. All three of them bring together a certain ethical approach with a certain approach to software design. So top-down combines an ethical view that regards moral capacities as consisting in an application of moral principles to particular cases, with a top-down approach in software design, a rule-based approach. So the basic idea is to formulate moral principles like the utilitarian principle of maximizing utility, or also Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, as rules in a software which is then supposed to derive what has to be done in a specific situation. The alternative are bottom-up approaches which do not understand morality as rule-based. So the view is closely related to meta-ethical particularism, a view that rejects the claim that moral capacities consist in the application of moral principles to particular cases. So rather, each particular case has to be judged individually, and on this basis, one might perhaps derive certain moral rules of thumb. So moral particularists used to think of moral capacities in terms of sort of know-how or practical knowledge in analogy to perception as attending to the morally relevant features of a situation. So in order to bring these capacities about in artificial systems, classical bottom-up approaches in software design, that is machine learning basically, which start in finding patterns in various kinds of data, have to be applied to moral learning, that is to a data set of moral judgments that human beings have made in a certain area of application. So top-down and bottom-up are the most common ways to think about the implementation of moral capacities in artificial systems. It is, however, possible to combine the virtues of both the types of approaches. So the resulting strategy is called a hybrid approach. And hybrid approaches operate on the basis of a predefined framework of moral values, which is then adapted to specific moral contexts by learning processes, and which values are given depends on the area of deployment of the system and the moral characteristics looked for. So the idea is you have this framework of moral values, which can then be adapted to specific contexts and also weighed in a different manner. So which approach to moral implementation should we choose? One might think of hybrid approaches. They're in the middle of the other two. For these reasons, they are better. But this would be too simple. So it depends really on the purpose and the context of use for which an artificial system is designed, which approach is most appropriate. And I'll suggest that in the context of care, a hybrid approach is the most adequate option for the kind of software module I have in mind. So I'll skip this. We all know the so-called Pflegenotstand is threatening. We have a real big, or will have and already have a big shortage of caregivers. And one idea is to use artificial systems to try to cope with this shortage, at least to some degree. So even if we take it for granted that it is undesirable to entirely substitute machines for human caregivers, there will be probably many situations in which the behavior of an artificial system that is in contact with a care-dependent person will somehow have to be morally regulated by itself. And this is sort of the idea to bring machine ethics or artificial morality into play here. The hybrid approach to a software module for geriatric care that I'm envisaging operates with a predefined framework of moral values in geriatric care. So that's the top-down element. However, the system should be able on this basis to adapt to the individual moral value profile of the user. So that's the specific idea that I bring to this debate, that we shouldn't, or we don't want one system for all, but each person should have an individualized system that sort of responds to their moral value profile. And that's the bottom-up element. So the ethical theory from which I'm departing is roughly Martha Nussbaum's and Amartya Sen's capability approach in ethics. So the idea is to determine certain capabilities that human beings need for well-being and flourishing, and to which they are morally entitled. That is, of course, life, bodily health, and integrity, but also the exercise of one's cognitive and sensual capacities, for instance. I'm going to subsume all these different capabilities somewhat loosely under the term moral values. So I think that one aspect that has not been taken sufficiently into account in the capabilities account is that capabilities are context sensitive to some degree. That is, they may vary over the individual lifespan. So they might not just depend on the person we are looking at, so on one's individual lifestyle, but also, for instance, on age. So people, I think, evaluate different kinds of capabilities in different phases of their life differently. So I think for this reason, it's particularly important to take into account the moral perspective of the individuals concerned in geriatric care, since it is difficult to anticipate the change of perspective for people who have not yet reached old age. And it's moreover to be expected that not all old people weigh moral values in geriatric care in the same way. So autonomy, physical health, and privacy are among the moral values that are relevant in geriatric care, but old people may differ regarding the weight that they ascribe to these values absolutely and relatively in comparison to each other. So how are we going to proceed if the question which decision is morally adequate in geriatric care is supposed to be answered from the perspective of those concerned? So I think first we have to determine which values they regard as important and how they weigh them. So one idea is to do surveys or qualitative interviews, and these interviews then should lead to a list of moral values that the individuals concerned consider as relevant. So this is, I think, also our task as philosophers, to give people or to interpret the answers that are given there, to make them bring them under categories derived from ethical argument and the history of ethics. In the second step, these values have to be operationalized such that an artificial system is able to recognize them and weigh them according to the moral value profile of the user. So this can be done, for instance, with the help of certain scenarios, which will deal with moral aspects of daily routines in geriatric care, particularly situations in which different moral values get into conflict. For instance, how often and how obtrusively is a geriatric care robot supposed to intervene if a care recipient is not moving? Individuals who fear that something or fear health risks might welcome such interventions. Persons who set great value on privacy might, in contrast, get rather annoyed. So this is one of the examples. In the third step, the results have to be implemented. So the system asks people to choose different options with regard to the presented scenarios, infers on this basis the moral value profile of the users. That is, which moral values the user cherishes and how they are ranked in comparison to each other. So on the basis of this information, the system tries to adapt its behavior in new cases to the moral value profile of the user. That is, it finds out, for instance, that a user ranks privacy high and is not so much worried that's because of health risks, and will intervene less obtrusively than in cases with profiles that are the other way around structured. And finally, the system's capacity of moral learning should not be restricted to the training phase. It should constantly adjust its model of the user's moral value profile by interacting with the user and giving him or her the possibility to evaluate the adequacy of the system's decisions. So does such a system possess moral capacities? I think that a system that can perform these functions is able to identify morally relevant aspects of geriatric care situations and to act accordingly, possesses states that are functionally equivalent to moral beliefs and desires. As explained above, this is the minimal requirement for being moral agents, and the system learns by training and interaction with the user to recognize and weigh moral values in alignment with the user's moral value profile and adapts its behavior accordingly. So the system possesses moral capacities in a basic sense. It is able to learn what is morally good and bad and how to treat persons according to standards that these people endorse. So originally, the target group of the proposed system was people who are not cognitively impaired and can still take fundamental decisions regarding their life, but are physically very frail, such that they really need help and support to live, for instance, in their apartment at home. Given the topic of the conference, this made me wonder whether it is possible to adapt this concept to people with dementia. And when I started to think about it, I thought that there might be some interesting ideas how to do this. And I would like to discuss these ideas with you later on. Would be happy to have some feedback there. So one idea is to use such a system in the context of biographical work and memory care, which are aimed at maintaining and supporting the identity and self-assurance of the patients. So in my framework, this would be primarily a matter of understanding the person in need of care. So given her social, historical, and cultural context, for instance. So the acquisition of a corresponding background knowledge of social, contemporary, or everyday history, so that is just required as a sort of, is required as well as special knowledge about the individual biography of the person in need of care, which would have to be made accessible in the context of the learning phase of the machine. So certain biographic actions, that was what came to my mind, could be exploited in decision-making situations by presenting typical options for action that match the personality of the person acting, so the person with dementia. And it would be central that the suggestions for the possible courses of actions are presented in a way that is, of course, appropriate to the situation and psychologically accessible to the person. So if the autobiographical memory of the user suffering from dementia is fed by their once autonomously made decisions, so it might be addressed during the operation, their own action goals could be sort of developed or specified on this basis. So the users would retain some kind of freedom of choice and could make their own decisions thoughtfully and sort of really in the way that they as persons used to do that in times of their life when they were sort of still capable of really making cognitive decisions or were not cognitively impaired. So in this way, the role of self-determination of those affected might be improved or preserved to some degree. And sort of the role of the system would then be different from, I think, the other case with the sort of cognitively non-impaired persons, because it's more about automatically recognizing possible causes of action and to make them explicitly or somehow implicitly visible in a given context. Since dementia patients are often bodily not that impaired, the system should rather suggest possible causes of action to activate people with dementia rather than execute these actions by itself. Yes, I hope that you can make also something out of these suggestions, and I would be very much interested in the discussion whether this is really a possibility or whether this kind of system is really, even in a modified form, not useful to cope with dementia or to cope with patients with dementia.
Okay, so thank you very much for your really interesting presentation. I might briefly add 2 comments. The last thing you mentioned rang the bell of subsidiary assistance with me, and I really like the roadmap for developing this assistive system, starting with identification and then operationalization. That also rang a bell. But I think we have a little bit time for questions. So there are questions. Andreas.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I have a question about your differentiation between artificial agent and artificial moral agent. As far as I understand you, is it sufficient to extend the model included into this artificial agent, representing the people in front of the agent? Is it enough to extend this model by whatever variables describing the moral profiles of these people? Or do you think that this reasoning itself in the agent has to be modified to be moral?
I think that sort of moral capacities are general agent capacities, but with one specific turn, which is to say, it's not just acting for any type of reason, but acting for specifically moral types of reasons. And sort of being very vague about what that is, I tried to give examples. So the idea, I think, probably it's about moral beliefs and moral desires. And it's of course a big debate in meta-ethics, how you can distinguish moral beliefs from any type of other beliefs. I tried it via content. So I tried to say that or refer to really values that we consider, or I consider, as moral values, and beliefs or desires that concern these moral values are moral beliefs or desires from my point of view. So how do you specify that? That's a question that I didn't address. There are some people who think you can do it formally, for instance, saying that you have some specific formal element of universalization or something that is specific to moral beliefs. I'm skeptical with respect to a purely formal distinction of moral beliefs. So I think you have to refer to content. I refer to these moral values, and I think in some sense what these moral values share is that there are about the sort of aspects or considering persons as ends in themselves. So in some sense, I think this is what's about moral values there. But I haven't really specified this point. So I think it's a sort of specific instance of reasons which are moral reasons and which can be sort of distinguished with the help of their content, which refers to moral values. I'm not sure whether I was addressing the question correctly, but I hope so.
I'm not sure, but I think it's a very interesting question in respect to implement systems, to distinguish whether this is, well, it's fundamentally different, this moral values, in respect to other values or features that can be used to describe a person. So, like size.
That's really an important point as well. And this probably refers to one issue that I have not been raising as well, and this is the issue sort of how robust is the ascription of moral values and or moral beliefs and desires to artificial systems. I mean, somebody like Dennett sounds at least occasionally like this is a purely instrumental thing. We do it when it's useful to speak in that way. I have suggested that it's a little bit more robust because I think it's not just an instrumental stance, it's sort of something, or we have designed these devices in exactly this way because we want them to recognize, for instance, certain values, moral values in situations. For these reasons, I do think that this is reflected in the design, and it's not just a purely instrumental stance, although it is, of course, different from what we ascribe to humans because there's no phenomenal consciousness, for instance. There is no capacity for really moral justification in the reflective sense where we really think about what are the right moral values.
I would really like to hook in there, but I also say,
Thanks, Thomas. Thank you, Catrin Misselhorn, for your talk. I think this hybrid model of geriatric, of machine ethics for geriatric care is really an interesting starting point. My question goes in the same direction, I guess. It's also about this moral values idea. You said you talk a bit loosely about moral values, and I wondered whether you talk too loosely about moral values because you might run the risk there of conflating moral values or values in a narrow sense with moral norms. Values as something that express preferences and priorities, as Oliver Burmeister said, things that are important to us and are kind of individual in a way. And on the other hand, moral norms, which we usually consider to be kind of more general or even universal and independent of individual preferences. So, I mean, for example, principles of justice or of respect for dignity and autonomy, we wouldn't want to make that dependent on individual preferences, would we? Like having a patient say, well, I don't care that much about my dignity, and then that would kind of justify being treated in a degrading way by a robot. We wouldn't want that, would we?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important point, and that is one of the reasons why I would be skeptical to use a bottom-up approach, because in my view, sort of the top-down level is somehow what you call moral norms, because this is sort of the level where we specify moral values that should be respected. But I think there is ethical pluralism at the level below. There is at least some degree of sort of weighing different values differently. For instance, I think that that privacy is a value that is a moral value, is a moral norm in this sense, if you want to speak like this. And for this reason, it has to be respected. But obviously, there is a certain sort of reasonable pluralism as to the degree to which you should do it. Or some people, obviously, I'm not on Facebook because I would find that for reasons of privacy problematic. I know a lot of people who are on Facebook, and I would say, well, I think I've got reason to sort of see things as I do, but we shouldn't prescribe people not to be on Facebook because they don't respect their own privacy. So this is the bottom-up idea that, yes, you are correct. There are certain moral norms that are not debatable. And for this reason, I think you need the framework. Also, because there are, of course, attitudes. For instance, if somebody would like to have an anti-Semitic or racist care robot, of course, this is not acceptable. So the person is not entitled to have this for moral reasons. So this is sort of the framework that sets the basic values or norms, but sort of how we weigh in between these norms. I think there is leeway for that. Although, and this is one of the reasons why I think such a hybrid approach is useful with respect to a personal care robot. But you are, of course, right. Such an approach would not be appropriate where we are speaking about justice, for instance, or with respect to autonomous driving, for instance, as an area of application. I think there you should not have this sort of leeway, or a system shouldn't have the leeway to respond to the user's individual moral profile, but that should be really sort of democratically legitimized and top down. So this is one of the reasons why I think hybrid is not always good, but it is good for a sort of personal care robot.
Okay, short organizational remark. I have now 4 remaining people on the stage, and I would disclose the stage here. That would be Stefan, Silke, Aaron Butler, and Eike. If someone has an urgent question, so it's possibly the last chance to raise your hand, but Stefan is next. Okay, fine.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a thought about your last slide about how this could apply to dementia. So I would imagine that with advanced dementia, the question might not be so much about what the system is doing, because this might be relatively clear in many instances, but the challenge might be more to find out how the system is actually performing the goal, where the goal is clear, like this locked door example. I mean, it's even beyond moral, it's legally clear. You cannot have a person which is not oriented walk out onto the street. So you have to lock the door, but like you can do it in a, let's say, more or less moral ways. So you just have the door locked, no comment on it, or you do it in some way where the dignity of the person is preserved. For example, offering some alternative activities, so to preserve the dignity of the person.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is perfectly right. So it would, of course, be wrong to sort of have the system adaptive in this way, sort of that it, for instance, responds to the desire of the person to walk out of the door or to open the door. So for this reason, I thought that probably here the idea would more be to activate people, to suggest courses of action that the person has valued before. And sort of for this reason, I think in some sense, the focus of the system, sort of instead of really performing tasks for a person, it would have to be rather on activating the person to choose certain courses of action that are, of course, morally sort of at least permissible, but for instance, maybe derived from things that the person liked to do before, or how a person wanted to do things before she started to suffer from dementia.
Silke,
thanks, Catrin. This was a great opening for today's session. I have two questions. The first is more a question again for clarification regarding your conceptualization of the agency term and the way how you use it. Just to be sure I'm understand you correctly, I mean the term agency has also like other key terms, quite a broad definition spectrum. So did I get you right that the way how you use the term agency is really in this sense very operational, and that you would, for example, say, of course, also, let's say, animals always have agency because they would fulfill your criteria, just to be on the same page, so to say. And would you even go so far, like I'm seeing your Latour post on your background, that any kind of things who can have a kind of flexible, who can impose flexible usage, so to say, would have already agency, or where would you then draw the line to, let's say automated things like a robot? So that's the one way. Just and the second is more general. If you favor a hybrid model of such a system, I was wondering where would you put now the responsibility issue? Because I think for the moral norm, for the top down, it's clear the responsibility seems to be on those who are designing and computing. But if you have a hybrid model, then and this model, so to say, would make failures or would then hurt somebody, who is then responsible? Is it just this robot, or is it still the designer and the computer sciences?
Yeah, thank you. Two really important questions. The first one is you well noted that I have not drawn a line. Sort of, I specified 2 dimensions of agency, and I said that I think that some artificial systems do have enough of these, or in these dimensions, enough of self-origination and acting for reasons to qualify as agents. But I didn't really draw a strict line. So animals, for instance, do animals have beliefs and desires? That's an issue. And if you really say that the dimension of acting for reasons has to be met, to some degree at least, then either you say that animals have mental representations that have some sort of, or are basic desires and beliefs, or you say that, okay, maybe there is already primitive agency without acting for reasons. I have not really taken a stance of this on this issue because I somehow tried to avoid, I guess, the really problematic points. So my idea was just to say, okay, some of them can have enough of it to qualify as agents, although we might debate about other things. I really think that probably we've got good reasons to say that at least some types of animals, dogs, cats, whatever, horses, may have something that very much resembles beliefs and desires. And I also think that we should think that already because of evolution, because we somehow, I think we need a picture that gives us some kind of idea how we can sort of derive such capacities. But this is really something that I haven't defended in the context of my work on artificial or robots as artificial agents. I would probably say that the last items, pure flexibility would probably not be enough, really. Yeah. The point of responsibility ascriptions. I think this is really a tough one. And I think that even top down doesn't really save us in this respect. And I think there are some cases where responsibility attribution is clear. It's either on the hand of the designers, it might be on the hand or on the side of politics, because, for instance, there must be regulations when such devices are considered as safe or can be sold. So there might be sort of issues of responsibility on this level. And there might, of course, be issues of responsibility with respect to the user. If the person doesn't use the device correctly, then the responsibility is in her hands. However, there are, as we all know, responsibility gaps, which sort of evolve when a system is doing, for instance, harming somebody. And this was neither a direct result of programming, nor of sort of political regulations, nor of some kind of sort of bad use or inappropriate use of the device. And this is, I think, a really important problem. And this is one of the reasons why I have always said that artificial systems should not directly take any decisions about human life or death. So they should not decide on who, for instance, is killed in war, or whom an autonomous car should hit in cases of dilemma situations. And so the easy way out would be to say, okay, this type of care robot shouldn't decide on life or death. But of course, there is a certain problem that decisions that the system takes might have an impact on life and death of a person. And how we could, for instance, prevent this as happening, not that the system is designed to take decisions. For instance, if a person asks for sort of help to suicide or something, then this shouldn't be allowed, I think. But maybe there are more sort of, there can result indirect decisions that, or there can be indirect decisions that result in the death of a person. And I think these are really the hard ones. And I must admit that I don't have a really good solution to this problem. And this is one of the reasons, I mean, in general, in machine ethics, that I'm maybe becoming more and more concerned with regulations by law, for instance, because I have the feeling that sort of some companies, for instance, have this idea, okay, we hire you as an ethicist, and then you tell us how the application has to look like. And I feel like, okay, I can do that. I've got some ideas, but should it be this way, how that is decided? And I have some concerns in sort of meanwhile that we sort of shouldn't start artificial morality in this way, sort of really unconstrained, at least when it comes to sort of to the market, to selling such devices. But I think we need really careful regulations there. And I think we should study these issues first and really see how we can avoid these situations. This is one of the concerns that I have sort of right now, that I think, yeah, we need more regulations, political regulations, really.
Thank you.
Okay, so in order to keep the delay we have so far, the last three interactions must be restricted to 1 minute each, that I would ask. So we have Aaron Butler.
Yes. Can you hear me all?
Yes.
Well? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so Professor Dr. Misselhorn, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it very fascinating, actually, and illuminating. I just have two quick conceptual clarification questions. So the first is with respect to the use of the term morally relevant. Could you say more about what you mean by that? I ask this question especially in light of I'm thinking of someone that might say, well, a technical artifact can be morally relevant without any discussion of its moral capacities. So I just would like some clarification as to what you meant by that within the context of this presentation. The second is also later in the presentation, you mentioned something about the relevant systems learning good and bad. Could you clarify what you meant by that, especially in light of the previous questions that were asked and your responses, namely by Professor Dr. Schweda and the gentleman before him, whose name I didn't hear. It's due to my audio, my apologies. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very cool questions as well. The first was morally relevant features. I think you are perfectly right. Artificial systems can confront morally relevant situations. Sort of what do I mean by that? Situations where moral values are concerned. Take, for instance, health risks. And of course, artificial systems can sort of come into such situations or even produce such situations without any moral capacities. That's right. But the idea was just to say that precisely because this is the case, they should better be able to respond appropriately to such situations. And the idea was that they would react more appropriate when they were able to explicitly react to moral agents, to moral values, to recognize moral values and to attempt to decide according to or take decisions according to moral values. Take into account, for instance, health risk explicitly. The second point, learning good and bad, morally good and bad sort of was really meant as what is morally valuable and what is not morally valuable, or what we think is morally valuable. And as I said, that might have sounded a little bit too out of hand, because I think we do prescribe a moral framework, but within this moral framework, the system learns to adapt to the specific moral value profile of the user. So that would be the idea of learning what is morally good or bad. It was really more about weighing morally good or bad, or weighing moral values. So you are right. I should have made that more precise.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have now taken up all the time that was available, so I would ask the last two persons on the stack, that's Eike and Jochen, to keep their questions until the final closing discussion. So, Catrin Misselhorn, thank you once again for this very interesting talk. So it was really interesting as you see by the discussion, and I would now like to hand over to Julia Perry for chairing the second part of the session and introducing our next speaker.
All right, while you are getting cabled up, I'll introduce you. I have the pleasure to introduce Tenzin Wangmo. She has been working at the Institute for Biomedical Ethics at the University of Basel since May 2011 and currently holds two positions. She is a senior researcher and a PhD coordinator. She obtained her PhD in gerontology from the Graduate Center for Gerontology, University of Kentucky in the US. And her research interests are the nexus of aging, public policy, vulnerability, and responsibility. Her current research expertise in bioethics include aging and vulnerability, caregiving and technology, and empirical methodology. So she has also worked on other bioethics topics, such as end-of-life decisions, reproductive rights, and healthcare data sharing. So we look forward to her talk today. It is based on previous, so past research, but also current projects on intelligent assistive devices and smart homes for older persons. So Tenzin, the floor is yours as soon as you are ready with your mic.
Yeah, just the mic. Thank you so much for the invite, Mark and Silke. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to meet all of you. Thanks to the Hanse-Wissenschaftskolleg for this wonderful venue. It is beautiful. Like Julia said my name is Tenzin Wangmo. I have worked at the Institute of Biomedical Ethics, and this research is based on the work that I've done in the last 10 years. I've done other things, but I just happened to fall upon it by chance. And with that, I would acknowledge the people who helped me first before starting what I would talk. I'm starting my presentation. These are Marcello Ayelka is now senior researcher at EPFL Lausanne. He was a PhD student working on this topic from the angle of neuroethics, and who more or less introduced me to this topic. Fabrice Jotland is here. He was Marcello's first supervisor, and I helped them in the project just by passing whenever I was needed. Since it was on technology, I tried to be as far as I can. Christoph Schneider was a research assistant who helped us with data collection on the second project that I and Marcello developed. Bernice Elber is the head of our institute. She has helped with Marcello's PhD thesis and also funded his project. Professor Vedro Kresi is the director of Felix Park's Geriatric Hospital in Basel, with whom I've collaborated for the last 11 years, and he has been very generous with his time, resources, and expertise in geriatrics. Angelina Tian is my PhD student working on my smart homes project, as well as Nadine Felber, who's another student working on the smart homes project. So the work that I present is a combination of work of all those who have helped me in the process, sharing their knowledge, teaching me, and we are learning together. KZS from the Swiss Academy of Medical Sciences funded one of my smaller projects on intelligent assistive technologies, and the Swiss National Science Foundation has been very generous with the funding for 4 years on the smart technology. And then I go on the limitations, not the limitations of my projects, but the limitations of general discussion that or general presentations that I have, as well as limitations of what we have been discussing yesterday and that we will discuss today and tomorrow, that older people that we are talking about now will be very different from those who will age in the next 30, 40, 50 years. So therefore, the ethics that we are thinking about now is not likely to be available, not likely to be applicable, or maybe it's a different ethics, or it's a different context that we are talking about. And also the technology savviness is different from the generations who aged like 20 years ago, started dementia in the early 2000s, and those who started dementia 2010, 2015, then those who are starting now, and as well as those who enter retirement. So these are all factors that we must consider in thinking about the ethics, as well as what the type of technologies that could be used for those who are older now, and what may or may not be possible for those all of us who will age in the future. So with these acknowledgements, the agenda today, also I had shortened my presentation quite a bit because of what was presented yesterday, to not be redundant. So I'll go very quickly on smart technologies, definitions, the ethical issues, and then present my empirical research projects, the results that have been published, the results that we are working on, and then conclude with three values or three concerns that I think are important to think about, and with those three concerns, it doesn't mean that the others that I haven't talked about are not important. It's just some of them were already discussed yesterday, the others might be discussed later on, and as a social gerontologist who happen to be in ethics, I want to present what comes with my background and my expertise. So I'm not a philosopher, so I cannot go into discussion of what is moralities. So do not ask me that. I ask my philosopher friends all the time, and the answers that I get are always insufficient. So I'm not happy with your question or the answers. With the With the smart technologies, the definitions, we know intelligent assistive technology is any type of technology that can more or less think. It has some computing power. It is either smart or will be smart, will become smarter with machine learning. Smart home, any type of home that would have sensors or any devices that could capture data. Smart home health technologies is what we are concentrating now, which would be any smart home that has the purpose to help the health and well-being of the older person. So we are not concentrating on devices that can clean, or devices that can cook, or devices that can just help with things that we don't consider it to be relevant for health. In a systematic review that we did, and it's published work, we found 539 intelligent assistive technologies developed between 2000 and 2016, which means that it seems that there is a lot of things available. That was my impression coming as a novice to IITs, that wow, there's so many things available, I don't remember seeing them. So they are there. So and they do different things, like general purpose. It would be activities of daily living, walking. They could theoretically help with cognition, motor functions, emotion, and social interaction. So these are things that IITs developed could potentially do. Same with smart home health technologies. We looked into different papers that talked about smart home health technologies and what are they doing. And we see monitoring technologies, which is like health data monitoring. This would be something that we are more familiar with. Variables, security monitoring, we are familiar with sensors. And GPS trackers, social interaction. I haven't seen any robot that seems to be very good with social interaction, but theoretically they are there. Cognitive and sensory assistant, and then it's understandable that half of the articles, or almost half of the articles, talk about technology that could do a combination, which is also interesting to point out, because if we kind of live in the future, live in a very technology-savvy world where technology is available for all of us, we probably do not want a robot that cleans our house, cooks our dinner, brings something, and then which would mean we may have to name them Eva, Ella, Marco, So that's too much complicated. It seems to be a complex world to live in. So therefore, a combination of these technologies seem to be developed, which makes sense, but at the same time, that would be a conclusion. I'll leave it there. These are things that Silke and Mark talked about. The population is growing. We know that we will have a lot of older people by 2050. Another issue related to aging is that we do not have cure for many somatic as well as cognitive diseases, which means that people have to live longer. Not only they live longer, they live with more physical and psychological ailments, therefore necessitating more care. And the problem that we face is younger people a bit younger than me, are choosing to have less children. We are not fulfilling the replacement value. As well as older people who are old now, there are almost 20% of the people who are old now decided before or could not have children. So we have older childless people now. There will be probably more older childless people later, which all means that we need more caregivers. We already heard a lot of caregivers unfortunately died during COVID. At the same time, as a family, all of us may have 4 people to care for, not only your parents, but the parents of your spouse, and your husband, unfortunately, is the only child, and you are the only child, you're more or less screwed. But if you have siblings, you can distribute care, but if you don't, so you're not in a good situation, both at the macro level of the state as well as the micro level of the family. So what we hope with smart technologies is that it could obviate or delay institutional care. So we would have to use them to some extent, that's a truth. And it could reduce caregiving burden, that's a hope. We do not know how much it could reduce, and that it could improve eventually if that happens. Quality of life, people are able to stay at home, they are happier, and we could include older people who are not mobile and cannot visit their friends with social interactions. So the ethical concerns that we mapped with IATs is that obviously only 33% of the technologies that we studied had ethical concerns, and they talked about very classical issues. And here, the IATs that we looked were that could potentially be used for dementia care. So therefore, a lot of the papers talked about autonomy, which makes sense because that is the key issue, that we have to think about autonomy of older people with dementia. How can they give consent? And then the others come like malfeasance, beneficent justice, interdependence, and privacy. Surprisingly, privacy didn't get much of the votes. Other ethical issues other concerns that we classified as ethical is the clinical evidence. Only half of these technologies had clinical evidence. So, however, the clinical evidence could be anything. It could be like, I tested it on one person and it was valid, right? So, since we are doing research, we have to box yes and no. And then the other issue is user-centeredness. Only 40% had user-centeredness, and we didn't really classify. It was actually user as a co-designer or user-centeredness, like I develop a technology, I give it to a team who does research on aging, say, could you please test? That's a different type of user-centeredness, but it is in that spectrum. The ethical issues that we found in our smart home health technology, which is nice that we find different ethical issues, and that's also what we hope. Because with each different technology, the ethical concerns should be different. If it's not different, then we have to go back and see, is it our bias as researchers that we are really concerned about certain norms that we think must be there, and we are looking for it. So luckily, we found privacy was our number one, human versus artificial relationship. That was one of the findings that actually got me attracted to studying IATs. If I hadn't found that, I wouldn't be doing research on this topic. And then autonomy, responsibility is new. Ageism and stigma is something new that we didn't find in IATs. And obviously there are different findings, so I wouldn't go through them. But what is interesting is with respect to human versus artificial, importance of human caregiving, that's something that we have talked about. Like preference to technology is interesting. Here the argument is, what if the older person likes the technology and starts liking the care given by the technology better than the care given by the person? Would it mean that the concept of care would change? And responsibility is, here we classified as downsides of responsibility would be, which as a gerontologist, I would say is possible that children say, I bought mom a laptop, she has the sensors, she has the iPad, I downloaded WhatsApp, she has FaceTime, she can call me whenever she wants, right? So these are the downsides, that I have done everything, now I don't want to go to visit her every Sunday if families are doing that, and kind of like, it's not convenient for me to go to every Sunday. Maybe I'm young and I go out at Saturday night to clubs and stuff, so I'm too tired to go. And I've done it before because I felt obligated, but now there's WhatsApp and FaceTime, and I've done everything. So this is the downside of responsibility, that you think you have cared for using the technology. And then there's the new responsibilities, which is more related to caregivers saying, I have to now learn this technology, so it's a new burden for me. I have to figure out how to do it, I have to do the other things that I'm still doing, and I have to make sure that she trusts me, or my mother or my father trust the technology because I trust her, so I have to take, it's an additional burden for me. So this is the new responsibility that people other participants seem to talk about. And then it's the fear of being stigmatized by others. This is something that we found in the systematic review. This is something that we found in our current study also, and not really what we found before, that older adults didn't wanted to use technology because they saw it as an othering process. It was something that could result in stigma. My friends would know that I have some difficulties, so can I just not use it? Or I wouldn't want to use it. So the studies that I have done, I have completed with all my colleagues 2 studies. The first one was part of the PhD project where Marcello interviewed 20 doctors, researchers, and nursing home administrators from Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. If any one of you participated, you know your data is here, but you wouldn't know who you are. And these were geriatricians, geriatrics, tech experts. So it was quite a different group of experts. The second one that we did with older adults living in the community. We did actually 20 interviews. We finally analyzed 19. One person got really offended with the project because he saw it as infantilizing. So he was offended that we were asking him about the technology. So he decided to withdraw his data. And we talked to people between 60 to like 92 years. So they were different age range. And the current one we are doing with older persons, their former caregivers, as well as the hope was to do direct informal caregivers like family caregivers, but we couldn't find the direct family caregivers. But we have done 22 interviews with older persons both in the nursing home and in the community, 23 formal caregivers, and this one we actually talked to caregivers who are actually providing direct care, so it's not the doctors who would be just doing something, but really nurses and nurse aides and social care providers who are actually spending like more time. And then we are still doing our informal caregiver interviews. In the first project with expert stakeholders, we asked them questions, we didn't show them anything. In the second one with older caregivers, on the older persons, we showed them the Apple iWatch stuff, Fitbit, and the second one is like a Clever Care. It's a software that was developed by a tech person in Switzerland to coordinate care, and it's kind of like a platform that would put together all the discussions and decisions by the healthcare person, caregiver, and the older person together, and then put it in a managed system that everybody would have access to. So it was quite nice. And the third one is a Teddy. It's supposed to be a smart robot. It wasn't at that time, kind of like a parable. So, and in the second study, we didn't we decided to do pictures because now we are going to do kind of like an elicitation technique where we take people from the least complicated assistive technology to more intelligent assistive technology. So we started with emergency buttons that older people tend to know, to wearables, sensors at home, what if the sensors have camera and they were recording your videos also, and robots like Pepper, which could do certain things, but obviously it's not available. So it is, in some ways, sensors and wearables are things that we have. Pepper is not something that we have, so people may know something about it, or they have seen it in TV, but not something that is already available. Generally, all the experts said that they were familiar with different IATs, but they haven't really used it, and they saw limited use. Obviously, this could be because they haven't used it. And the key issues that they talked about was we were not part of the discussion. No, we are not part of it. We were not asked. We don't know if others are being asked. It's the user-centered issue, and also they were critical about there's not enough clinical trials, so they do not know the validity of these technology. And if I don't know the validity of the technology, I cannot recommend it to my patients because they may use it because they trust me. With the older adults that we interviewed now and before, it's interesting that there is some sort of not a generation, some sort of like a generation gap. The oldest have never used IATs, so they would not know what it is. It seemed that they retired in the late 1999 or 2000 type of time when they didn't really have to use technology for their work, or they were quite wealthy that they didn't require it later also, or they didn't have children who would tell them, well, it's really cool, use this technology. Those who were using it, using like the wearables and the smartphones, were the young olds and the middle olds. And the middle olds were more using it because the grandchildren like talk about it, said, use computer, will teach you. And the young olds were using it because it was something that they started using as part of the work. So although they were a bit older, they had to use it, they had to start using emails, and then after emails it got from the big computer to the laptop to the iPad and then iPhone, and it gradually proceeded. And those who use it and saw the gradual progression always said, if there would be technology that could help me live independently and safely, I would use it. And then it was important that they could stay at their own home, which is what we have heard before, as well as that they would trade off privacy. So they were willing to trade off privacy for independent living. And here the interesting argument is, if I can't live at my home, I have to go to the nursing home, which means I give up privacy there anyways. So if it's a trade-off, I would rather stay at home and give some privacy than go into a nursing home and maybe have to give more privacy. Issues of informed consent, mostly talked by the expert stakeholder, but more about people with dementia cannot consent. We have to think about advanced directive and also the behavior at that point to even think about if people have theoretically agreed in the advanced directive that you could use Paro for me. At that time, the person says no, or shows behaviors that could be interpreted as no, you would stop it and stop using it. And here also we have to think in the sense of informed consent that if we are looking at intelligent technologies that could develop in time and become smarter, what the person or I have consented today is different to the technology that I would consent to in 2 years, because this technology would have become so smart, which means for a person with dementia, the issue becomes more challenging, because you can say, okay, the person agreed it before, but then the person agreed before to something that he could have understood at that time, but not something that keeps on developing. Very interesting issue. Well, about Paro and Teddy was the issue of deception that came more from the stakeholders. Deceiving people is wrong. I do not agree to it. And on the other side, it was, well, it is deception, but it's the well-being of the person who's more important, and therefore it's fine with me. Older people on the IAT project talk more about infantilization, so they didn't like the Teddy or the Paro because they associated it with something, a toy that a child has. So it's a toy that my grandchild has, it's something that I would buy for my grandchild, therefore I don't think that I would want to use it. At the same time, the other interesting issue was it's not just infantilizing, it's saying, I don't use it, but those older people in nursing home can use it. Those people with dementia could use it, and they may find it useful. That is indirect, that's direct stigmatization without older people realizing that you are stigmatizing part of your own group and a group that you may fall in the future. And data protection, data security, I guess here there's nothing important other than the possibility of shutting off the devices, which with dementia people may not know how to shut off. Interestingly, the older person tend to be very trusting of the healthcare providers. They would not mind sharing data with the healthcare providers whatsoever. So to me it seems like an overtrust, but it could be some a general cultural thing. Issues of justice and fairness was always related to the issue of cost. Who will pay for it? These are technologies that are expensive. The experts were more, I guess, differentiated in the responses that, well, if we have open source data, the technologies would become cheaper, then everybody would get it. Healthcare insurance could potentially, pay for it, and that would be nice. Others said, well, technologies created inequality all the time. It's not new. No, there were times that none of us could afford iPhones. Now we all can afford smartphones. it has become cheaper, that we have to use it, and kind of like the electricity example. People didn't have electricity, not everybody had it before, it was expensive, now everyone has it, so maybe the issue would solve itself with time. And then the older people have different ranges depending on their socioeconomic status. Those who are quite well off said, if I need it, I can buy it, I'll buy it. But at the same time, those who don't have it, you know, like we live in Switzerland, it's our social healthcare system, the healthcare system is supported, and those intelligent technologies that have clinical validity should be paid by the health insurance. So we have all these type of different responses. And one thing that came again with the stakeholders as well as the older people is technology should not replace human care. And here they were adamant, and I subscribe to it to a certain extent, that there is something with human care that we crave for and we want in the present, but at the same time we also have to take this type of response, thinking that these are people who may not know a lot about technology, and therefore there's a fear of technology that kind of leads to their responses that it shouldn't never be replacement, but a substitution, or maybe like a harmonious balance of the two. So I have a few conclusions based on my general thinking, and then here I may go into a bit of tangent. And the first thing I think is user-centeredness. So here we talk about including people, which is obviously important, including not only the affected person, the people around them, to get different types of data, to know some, to have a better idea of the truth, right? Else we can say the older people are saying a version that the caregivers will negate, or the physicians and the nurses may think, no, like that's not important. So we need a whole rounded data that is valuable for the development and refinement process. And here we really should critically think of the selection of the user group, right? What is user-centeredness? It is, are we talking, because there are studies with IETs for older people, theoretically could be used for older people, but the tests have been done with younger people. No, so this is a classic mistake. Maybe a decade ago people did it, maybe we don't do it now. I do not know, but this is something to think about. And then decide what the purpose of this technology is. Is it to help the caregivers, or is it to help the older people? Because if it's to help the older people, if you only took the opinions from other group, it may not be right. And then whose burden is more important to relieve, the burden of care or the burden of the person who is suffering? And then it's with people with dementia, the other people could theoretically consent to these studies. People with dementia cannot really consent in all the cases. Therefore, a technology developed for people with dementia has to be developed in a clear way that these individuals are included, and to kind of think the area, the time when they can consent, or what type of consent do we need? Do we need advanced consent, or do we need consent based on time? So we know Mr. George is able, usually he seems lucid from like after lunch, or maybe in the morning. So we have to figure out these details, which is difficult for researchers to do all the time, but this I think is burden on the researchers and the technology people to do it correctly and not assume that, okay, we can ask, it's people with dementia, we can ask those who are a bit senile. No, that's not right. And then obviously it comes to the issue of the test participants and the co-creators. Co-creators seems to be a very nice idea. Test participants, I'm a bit hesitant about, because they are used for a purpose. These older people are used for a purpose. Whether the recommendation goes into an IIT into the development is not known, because they are not part of a cycle. They are one process, one part of a process. And they are living labs that are doing wonderful research. At the same time, they are also, to be viable, looking into the market franchise, that they could be research organizations where tech developers can come and say, could you do this for me? And then there's a cost to it. And with living labs and all this research, I see the problem of like purposive sampling, because these are people in the community who agree to participate. And then there could be living labs who say, we have a very big like network. We have 200 nursing homes that have agreed to participate, but then in these nursing homes, it could still be the same people who are agreeing to participate, and we get into these concerns about learning bias and social desirability bias. If the older person is using these research activities for social interactions, I, as an older person, would really like Mark to ask me again and again to participate in the study, and then I want to give the data that he is maybe looking for and not say all the negative things that I really believe, because then he'll say, well, no, Tenzin is not reliable, she's negative all the time, right? And then the second value that I would propose is responsible creation and responsible production of smart technologies for caregiving. And here, the question like I asked yesterday, what type of technology should be provided? We really critically have to think what is that we want, and what is that should be promoted. Not everything that is good is, well, not everything that grows is gold, right, or something. And then the human care replacement debate is a valid debate at the moment that should be enhanced. The no-choice approach, like Oliver said, there is a need. I understand there is a need, or no, there is not enough children to care for the older adults. There's not even healthcare providers. That, saying there's a need, we have to use technology. In my opinion, that's the easiest answer that anyone could say. And Mark said we could train more caregivers. That's true too. We could train more caregivers. We could be even more intelligent. And I was thinking what other things could potentially the healthcare system with the existing resources in developing countries like ours could do. We have huge number of refugees and immigrants. Like if you think in Switzerland, most of the nursing aides are immigrants, and that might be the case in Germany too. The nursing age people have quite a level of experience. So you could retool them to become, in Switzerland it would be a FAG, Fachperson Gesundheit, it's like a 2 years training. You can train them to a higher level and recruit other new immigrants who are looking for these nursing aides. Apparently in Switzerland, the data I saw, there's too many nursing aides, so people wanted to do, it's just not a field that you are likely to get a job because there are too many of them. The fields, the positions that are opening up is the FAG and the registered nurses. So you could retool people in the system to have higher positions, which I would find a better choice. And then obviously we'll have to use some technology, and we have to decide which one. In one of the paper with a student, we talked about at which point we will accept robots for intimate care in nursing home, and we decided that for activities of daily living that require privacy. So we would think it's ethically okay to use robots if there were robots who could help with activities of daily living. It's ethically acceptable to use it, for example, in going to the bathroom, taking a shower. These are private activities that we have done for years, and these are not activities that we want to do with even a caring caregiver. No, not even with your husband or your children. You would feel awkward that your child is taking you to bathroom and helping with the shower. So maybe robots could be used in those situations, because there is the dignity of the person that is preserved, and there, it's the dignity of the self. So the person does not have to be, although the caregiver or the children may not be humiliating them, you could feel a bit humiliated that now you have to have this care. And in the nursing home context, it is often these situations of private care that we see elder abuse happening. So these could be avoided, not only elder abuse by older person towards the nurses. Because of different reasons, people may hate and Nurses are not that happy and they're scared. So the abuse happens both ways. So this could be a good solution. And also, I think there's responsibility to avoid furthering ageism and stigmatization. To have design features that would not advance these things, to be cognizant that older people are already stigmatized as a group by our society and not to feed into this system. And then Paro, like I talked about, it was clearly seen for dementia patients, and the question is, should they be used in the future for those who know Paro and are likely to say, I don't want to use Paro, I associate with older people with dementia, and we have studies using Paro with people who have dementia, but these studies were done when those older adults already had dementia and Paro was designed at that time, and they wouldn't have known that Paro existed in the past, and now they are older adults, and the young older adults and the middle older adults who know about Paro's existence, and should it be used for them. And the last value that I would like to promote is early and careful selection. That would be a continuation of my previous recommendation. Early adoption is important to ensure familiarity and stability. We all have body memories, right? So if these technologies are introduced early enough to older persons with or without any functional impairments, because the likelihood of functional impairments would increase with age. It's not that very few older adults would all of a sudden die and they're very healthy. Usually we have this concentrated time where we are likely to be very sick and then we'll die. So it's better to be prepared, and then to be able to select as an older person what type of technologies I want. So if in the future we have these multi-purpose intelligent robots, I can, as an older person, I can already select those. No, I don't like to clean, so something that cleans. I don't like to take heavy objects. I want the robot to help me in the bathroom, but I don't want the robot to talk to me. I don't like the talking robot. I have enough friends who would come and visit me, and I believe my children are really good and they'll come and visit me, right? So you can have these selections, and then your caregivers, your children, would know about these selections, and once you happen to have dementia, they would be confident that mom or dad would still continue to use it because she selected them. So it's kind of like advanced care planning for technology, and also better substituted judgment. So it's not surrogate decision making, it's more a decision that I would have likely made for myself, my children are making for me, and they are happier, and hopefully I'm happier when I have dementia. This goes to what I said before, that caregivers and physicians are the trust persons, right? So they are the trust persons, so they should introduce technologies that are useful, reliable, clinically tested, all that, but to also ensure that it is not used as a caregiving. Now, that is something very important that we should not, at least in this context and this age, should not fall into the trap that technology becomes the caregiving. It's like the monetary value given. I provided money to my parents, I don't have to care for them, and it is the financial transaction becomes caregiving, and now it would become technology is given and it is like caregiving. And that I conclude.
So Tenzin, thank you very much for your presentation and for the insights into your empirical work. Are there any questions or comments? Okay, let's start with Johannes at the backup.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. So quite interesting insights, and I think we have several parallels to our findings and results from our empirical study. I wanted to ask two questions regarding your findings, and one question you answered nearly at the end in your conclusions, but I was wondering regarding those, or the risk, so to say, that people in need of care would prefer technology against their human caregivers. And I wonder if this is really a very new thing of course, with regard to technology, yes, but we also see this with regard to different human caregivers, that there are preferences between persons, and that there are, as you highlighted at the end, different preferences regarding the different fields of care, so to say, or application fields of care. So someone would like to get intimate care by a robot because he feels embarrassed by a human caregiver, but want the more emotional social contact to human caregivers instead of robots. So I wonder if this is really very new, or this is a general preference thing. And what I wanted to ask secondly is regarding this chance of, or this opportunity to obviate or delay the need for institutional long-term care. And this is an opportunity which is often mentioned in the literature as well as in empirical research. And I wonder if so many older people want to stay at home as long as possible. And we focus on this very much, and we emphasize this also regarding the technology development. And I wonder, and would be interested in what you say, if we are, against this background, still or again sensitive enough for those people for which going to an institutional home would be probably the better choice, the better alternative with regard to social participation, with regard to safety, with regard, you mentioned it, to privacy issues. Are we sensitive as researchers as well as technology developers?
The easy answer is no, we are not sensitive, because we are going with a baseline that living at home is the highest important goal for all the older people, which obviously may or may not be true. I met one older person who was very healthy, beautiful woman, and she was in nursing home, and I thought, that's so weird, why is she in nursing home? And she said, I chose to be there because I would get there, in the future. So I wanted to go there early enough to go to a nursing home that I like, and also to know these people before I may have dementia. So she went in with this kind of a cognition that it was important for me, it was a better place for me than being at home, because I was alone there. So I can make new friends. So there she had certain characteristics that she can make new friends. Not everybody can make new friends. So here, but I agree that we are overemphasizing on the value of home. And there are some more affiliations, because we believe that the home is a place where you have privacy, it's stable, it's familiar. So if anything happens, you are more likely to be happy. You're more likely to be happier at home and dying at home than anywhere else. So it is a bias that we have. For your first question of we prefer between people anyways. So if we prefer technology, is that necessarily bad, right? Or is it necessarily different from preferring humans? I'm not a philosopher. I guess on a philosophical level, a philosopher would say, maybe technology is better, I don't know. But at a human level, for the older people that I'm thinking about, I do think this replacement is not necessarily good for them. But for the future older people, I do not know, and I would not be surprised if they would actually like technology care than human care. A small anecdote, when I went to the US, I was amazed with how much how much a lot of things have become automatic. People do not want to even talk with like Starbucks people, and they don't want to even order with their mouth. They do it on the app, which is amazing. It's a level of automation that they have accepted, and they feel really comfortable with it. So these type of people, I would think, would love technology care. And a person like me, I wouldn't. I'm not sure if I have the best answer for you, but Johannes, I tried.
So, Rebecca, please.
Thank you, Tenzin, for your interesting talk. In one of your first slides, you reported on the clinical evidence, which was proven for like 49% of the IITs. Could you please define or describe a little bit further the methodological approach to measure the clinical evidence, or which outcomes have been, on which outcomes reported or the studies have been reported? And the second question is, you assess the cognitive status of your older participants in the studies or in the interview studies you conducted?
On the IITs, yes. On the IITs, we were referred by the genetics hospital to patients that they knew that they were cognitively able to talk to us. For the smart homes, older people in the nursing home, the nurses referred us to people who we could talk. So they were confident that these people.
So without any cognitive impairment.
In any cognitive limitations. And also because of ethics approval, we couldn't talk to people with dementia, so we had to be careful that anybody we talk to could literally give consent, and also written consent, so not oral consent. For the first question on the clinical validation, I cannot remember very clearly, but if I remember clearly, there were 3 or 4 studies that were randomized trials. So all the clinical validations were really bad clinical validations. So it could be, they tested it with one person and they found a positive result. So it was actually a test and not like a design recommendation, like a user-centered one. So we differentiated these 2 categories like that way.
Thank you.
Stefan Steinberg.
Yes, so I think I had a kind of fun comment on your last point on the care given. So I think this is a really good point. And the interesting thing is that in the patient and physician interaction, care given is often defined when the physician prescribes some medication, which actually results in the fact that 95% of medication people take are not even justified by any rational reason. So I think if the alternative for a physician would be to prescribe a social robot, it might have at least less negative impact on the health of the patient than the medication. But it's only a side comment.
That's interesting, and here we assume that the technology would be refunded by the health insurance.
It's a medication, it might at least have less side effects.
Oh, good point, thank you.
Good. I have one more question. If there's any other questions, I'd suggest that we have those in the coffee break. So I'd like to take up your point of advanced decision making, and you mentioned in your last slide of selecting in advance. And I think there's a common criticism about anticipating decisions, making decisions for the future, and that especially rely on lack of experience. And I think with assistive technologies, we actually have a chance to change this, like in contrast to medical decisions. You can't really stage resuscitation, or you don't want to enroll people in trials. So I'm kind of wondering how you think this could work. And because I think you mentioned a little bit regarding your living labs, but I think it could be even earlier.
Exactly.
So confronting, not just looking at what exists, but actually testing devices, taking them home, looking at them, seeing what would maybe be possible. Of course, always allowing for the situation when people may refuse the use with it, if it's verbal or physical, to of course respect that. But how do you think this could be possible in practice?
What I was proposing is the early introduction. So it must be introduced to older people when they are actually healthy. So if you do that, you can assume that the advanced care planning, that now they are familiar with the technology. Obviously, we come to the other issue that these are machine learning, so they will be a bit different from what they are used to. So even if I have a technology, and assuming in the nice technology world that they are machine learning and the AI would bring wonders to our human life. No, so so if I have used it for at least 10 years, you can confidently you can be more confident that I would like it. So this is the advanced planning that I'm talking about, and not really the living lab where you're testing. So it's somebody actually buying you the technology, and here the assumption is we have the money to buy the technology. So I'm going on a lot of premises, right? We are rich enough. Our children are not loaded enough to buy us these things. But I do think it has to be much earlier than just being a part of the living lab and testing different things. I don't think that's a solution. I think that's more of a research enterprise of community engagement, which is good and everything, but it's not really something that we can say, my mother went to living labs and she was a member of living labs, so therefore I think she would be very happy with IATs. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, thank you very much. So now we have about 9 minutes until we continue, so short coffee break to relax, talk a bit, but then I think we should continue at 12.
Okay, so welcome back to our symposium and the next session. So we have approximately 1 hour, and of course we would like to start. So a short introduction in our speaker now. So first speaker will be Mark Schweda. So Mark is professor since end of 2018 at the University of Oldenburg at our faculty, however exact name is, at the Department of Health Services Research, and he's head of a medicine group. And I think just right before we start, we had already the idea of IDEC, and we have submitted this proposal to the BMBF. So more or less immediately after you arrived in Oldenburg, we started this project, and this is of course one of the first projects we doing together. And so therefore, welcome, of course. And well, we are interested to listen to you and to.
Thank you. You're able to hear me now? Okay, thank you. I have the pleasure to introduce to you Silke Schicktanz. Silke is a full professor at the Department of Medical Ethics and History of Medicine at the University Medical Center Göttingen, where she leads the working group Cultural and Ethical Studies of Biomedicine. Further, she has held various research positions at universities in Germany and internationally, including an adjunct professorship for philosophy at the San Francisco State University and a visiting research scholarship at the University of California, Berkeley. She currently, as you all know, holds a research fellowship here at the Hanse-Wissenschaftskolleg and her research focuses on normative and lay concepts of autonomy, trust, and responsibility, the relationship between ethics and empirical studies, as well as cultural differences in bioethics, and she has a specific interest in ethical and social issues of prevention, prediction, and early diagnosis of dementia, as well as the use of technological assistance in dementia care. So we're happy to hear you both. Both yours.
Well, thanks a lot, you two, for your kind introduction. This is another input and viewpoint from our IDEC project, in a way. We talked a lot already about smart technologies as an object of ethical reflection, and we'll now shift the focus a little bit and talk about and like to discuss with you about smart technologies as a tool, as an instrument, as a method of ethical reflection of smart technologies. So there's a kind of a loop there also. So ethical challenges to assistive technologies, AI-assisted ethics as a way forward. We started these considerations, which we're currently trying to formulate into a joint paper of the research team, from the observation that many current ethical debates on IATs, on intelligent assistive technologies, frame these technologies in terms of a product. So we have a given technology, a given product, and we try to define ethical criteria, ethical rules for its reflection. So this is a kind of technology-oriented ethics in a way. Problem-oriented, an exploration and assessment of issues that should be solved by technology. And for example, as it is also used in ethics in design approaches, where we kind of try to formulate a list of ethical criteria, of ethical principles, of ethical rules that should be implemented, should be built into the technology. Now, these are, of course, very valuable approaches, but they have certain limitations. For example, they often then start from very general ethical principles and rules that then kind of deductively are applied to concrete cases. And as we have already seen yesterday and today, the matter of adaptation to individual situations, individual contexts, and individual preferences and concerns is a major challenge in this context. And these kind of product-oriented, technology-oriented approaches, we think, have a low level of personal and cultural adaptation. And we should aim for more, for an increased individual and cultural adaptation. Now, one example of IATs, of course, are tracking and assistance systems that help people with dementia to cope with disorientation and to cope with wandering behavior, which is very common in dementia. So, for example, we have tracking technologies, we have mobile phones, or even hidden trackers, something in your shoe, for example, that helps kind of track and detect your location, and either helps you, provides signals to you that help you orient yourself and navigate through an environment, or alarm other people in cases you're running the risk of getting lost or being in danger. Now, a lot of these technologies, of course, are already available on the market, and the ethical reflection is going on. But the problem is that the different values that are involved here, we already addressed them. It's about autonomy and independence on the one hand, about being able to orient yourself and make your ways through a certain environment. It's also about privacy. It's also about safety and protection of your safety. It's also, of course, a matter of cost efficiency and cost saving, costs that accrue once you, for example, get lost and have to be recovered. Now, all these different values, they need to be balanced, and the way how they are balanced is not obvious, it's not trivial. So it wouldn't be sufficient, for example, to simply go with a safety first policy, because we know that some different people, different user groups might have different values. On the other hand, it's also not sufficient to simply put autonomy first and user autonomy first, because we found in our own studies that different users not necessarily prioritize personal autonomy in the context of these tracking devices. Some of them would make a trade-off and would say, as Tenzin, for example, described these trade-offs, I would kind of, how do you say, I would verzichten. I would be ready to accept a lower degree of self-determination, of autonomy, for the sake of increased safety, for example. And so the question is, under these conditions, what could be a way forward for the ethical evaluation and the ethical discussion of these technologies? They have such a kind of discussion, and the development of these technologies must consider various stakeholders, their different, as we said, moral priorities, value priorities. We also already addressed yesterday the point that fluctuating cognitive capacities have to be taken into account. People with dementia have varying levels of lucidity over the day very often, and so it's important to also consider this varying framework condition. And we also have to take into account limited communication opportunities between humans and the AI. Now, one way, of course, to approach this and to kind of take care of these issues would be by life experiments of new technologies. We just test them in context with users, but of course these users belong to vulnerable groups, and so research ethical issues may arise, and we may actually have to also conduct these experiments with much larger groups of people than we are now focusing, and usually rather small samples. Another way out could be thought experiments, of course. So we kind of devise fictional scenarios, what could happen, and what kind of attitudes and what kind of results different user preferences could produce. But thought experiments are also tricky in these contexts, because the situations and the technologies are very complex, and it's difficult to really devise all the different aspects in one thought experiment, one scenario. And of course, as we said, there are many different moral views involved, and it's difficult actually to include all these different moral views in one thought experiment. So limitations there on the side of live experiments, in situ experiments, and also thought experiments. What could be the way forward? Silke.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So this was a kind of, analysis during our first year of the project, where we realized that, de facto, there are taking place a lot of in situ experiments, for example, and at least philosophers and sometimes social scientists have a tendency more to focus on so-called thought experiments, like how would it be to live with this robot, and would I like to have it? And we do this, by the way, all the time during this conference, for example. But we realized that this is somehow a limitation. And a couple of colleagues, I mean, already in the past, like Tenzin, but also Catrin again, mentioned it. Of course, a third way, first of all, is to ask those stakeholders. And this is what also we did in our research project. And for example, the research projects by the early career researchers of Eike Buhr and Johannes Welch very nicely contributed to the next points, namely exactly the idea that within the set of well-known moral values, Tenzin, you have shown them in your reviews, we have found similar kind of values raised, but the true question, so to say, is how these different values are, so to say, prioritized or balanced, so to say, in particular situations. So we, in our study, also trained as empirical ethicists, so to say, actually did this, that we started to use interview material to analyze what could be type of, we call it argumentation patterns, that indicates that people have a kind of priority of particular values. And of course, these again, and this on the one hand is an opportunity to have to go beyond a kind of blurry list of values and to have in the next step more intense and more detailed understanding that people are kind of a moral type, so to say. But of course, they are again idealized. So there's again a limitation in the methodology, but still I think it's a way forward already to consider that some people would classify themselves, I'm more this autonomy type of person. However, of course, I would not risk everything in my life because of autonomy. And then you have perhaps another person who self-characterizes herself as a person, I always like to be on the safe side, and so on and so on. So we do this all the time, and it has something to do with concept of moral identity, for example. So we thought this could be a good way out to solve this kind of problem, how to go further with this knowledge that we have around different moral values. And this is exactly what the analysis did. This is a table conceptualized as an example by Eike, for example, that they analyzed the interviews. Remember in the introduction talk, I showed you these little case studies we were using in our interview study where people were confronted, so to say, with particular cases of using intelligent assistive technology and what would they prefer or what would be their concerns regarding privacy, regarding empowerment and other values. And so it was a kind of work, so to say, from a philosophical point, and to translate these kind of lay statements on moral opinions into a kind of ethical categorization. And this is exactly what Eike and Welch and other PhD students involved did jointly. And so this helped us finally to develop something what actually they call these value profiles. The idea is you have idealized types, and this is just a list of few. There are more, but it's also interesting that it's kind of saturating within your material. And I think this is another interesting insight. If you interview 20 people, it's not automatically that you will automatically have really 20 different types, but people somehow can sort or at least adjunct themselves to particular so-called value profiles. So for example, on the one hand, we have 3 profiles here displayed as examples who are developed out of the material from interviews with persons who are in an early stage of dementia, for example. This is what we call the affected profile. And for example, there is this type of individual self-determination, and this even was a value profile, so to say, who made statements like, I would, even on the risk that I would be killed because I lose my orientation, for no purpose, so to say, I would be interested to have a tracking device that, so this could be like this, risk person, so to say, who really focuses on strong self-determination. But this is not the only way how autonomy, for example, and self-determination was understood. So there was another type, what we called relational autonomy. And here already people start to integrate in their self-orientation, of their self-interest, so to say, what would be also the impact for those who are caring for me, for those I'm loving. So it's already still focusing on autonomy, but this autonomy is not, so to say, in an egocentric or, let's say, totally individualistic perspective, but it already considers the impacts for third persons, but not for everyone or the society, but especially for those who are supporting me in my self-expression. And another trade-off, of course, here can be then privacy, in the sense that because I'm willing to share at least some part of my data with first my closest relatives, but not with everybody, of course, this is a kind of, limiting at least a radical idea of privacy. And then, for example, another example we also found in material of our professional caregivers, and there perhaps the interesting observation was that within the moral identity of professional caregivers, the variety of so-called value profiles was not as large as it was within the group of persons who were affected. And so obviously there's already displaying a kind of professional ethos. And this professional ethos is often focusing, of course, on safety issues. So it's my professional responsibility to care about the safety. So it's not astonishing. But this also already shows it would be problematic to focus only on value profiles of caregivers, because they are, so to say, they have their own responsibility as a priority, which we appreciate, so to say. But it would, so to say, give us a false idea what would be in the interest, in the self-interest of persons who are affected. And at least I think this is what we are interested in IIT. So what is the opportunity of having these types of profiles? So you already have seen yesterday this quite complex figure that Thomas showed in his presentation, and this was a kind of joint work which came out in the second year of this project, where we realized that there is even a tendency perhaps in engineering and informatics to have mainly this professional ethos on forefront. Namely, safety is always the most important thing. And then we added this, oh listen, I'm not sure it's always about safety when you develop these kind of intelligent assistive devices. So after having many workshops and internal debates, we started to think, but it's true. I mean, many of these intelligent devices can have quite a complex interaction with different types of actors, human actors, like the patients, the caregivers. It's quite complex to assess all these dimensions. And so this is the way how we thought perhaps we can build in, and this is what Thomas then did together with Salman to develop further this idea of how to build in different ethical insights into a kind of simulation. And this is actually where we want to head in the future, namely to use or to consider more practically that for particular complex situations, which mean there are various moral value profiles, moral values that have to be balanced, we have different actors, we have particular situations which perhaps raise different questions of responsibilities. It's not simple, so to say, to assess the impact of this technology, whether it's for the engineers or the ethicists, but what could help us are using these kind of models, simulation models, which then display, as Thomas again did yesterday, visualize particular outcomes. So what happens if the device X does this on that person? What happens if we would give this device a different policy, and so on and so on. And the other point is that we have also not purely now an AI simulation that replaces ethicist and ethical reflection, but we have on different stages, so to say, also an impact where empirical data and ethical reflection of humans, so to say, come in. So first of all, it's on the A level, where in the so-called stakeholder model, already data we collected, for example, in our empirical studies, whether it's surveys or qualitative research, is already built in. So it's not just out of the blue how it's conceptualized, but it's already fed, so to say, with insights from empirical data. And this empirical data, of course, can then be not only under-complex, but can, of course, already seen as kind of a complex level. The next point is this kind of feedback loop, because as you already saw yesterday, I mean, these kind of simulations can produce visualized outcomes of how, under which conditions, what type of values are perhaps violated and when not. And then again, it's not that this analysis is sufficient, but it allows us then, so to say, as external viewers, so to say, again, to reason about this. What would we accept? What type of violations would we accept or not? And then we have a third way of integrating then ethical reflection, namely that if we then change, for example, this policy and do another run and change some kind of factors, again, we can then propose, okay, how would it be to change the policy level? How would it be that if we have a different stakeholder model because we perhaps expand our data? So it's a kind of methodology, and perhaps I like to use here the term from Gerhard Fischer yesterday. It could be even understood as a kind of meta design, namely to have a methodology that helps us to reflect more appropriately or in complementary way to the way we already do in practice. So here on the last slide, we are aware that, of course, also this type of approach, which we think is quite new, has advantages and, of course, challenges. So on the one hand, we don't see it as a replacement of existing value in design approaches or participatory approaches, but there are limitations. And everybody who does participatory ethics research knows, especially when it comes to people, persons with dementia or with other particular vulnerable groups, there are a lot of limitations limitations to access to this group, but it can be also, pose research ethical problems. Often we have some small sample sizes. Those who do qualitative research know 20 interviews, 40 interviews is quite a lot. But we all know the critiques then from more the quantitative research saying, but what are 40 persons you have interviewed, given with the fact that we perhaps have in Germany 1 million patients? So, and that's, that's fair enough, a critique. And the third problem is when we have these kind of exercises, and I think you already pointed that out, and that's the anticipatory problem. We tend to assess technology, for example, on our current experience. So we are biased, so to say, what we can imagine. So, and then perhaps we have very blunt ideas and a super utopian idea, or this future technology can do this, this, and this, or it's super dystopian in a sense. So we are not really, I think, very good in anticipating a lot of nuances. So in this sense, I think this simulation offers an opportunity. The second point is that, as I already showed, the simulation concept we are proposing has different feedback loops on different levels. So this goes beyond the idea that the machine itself, so to say, solves all the questions. But, and now here are the challenges, and this is what we also realized in this project, it needs new competencies. Also among the ethicists, for example, it took us quite a time to understand all these figures that Salman and Thomas offered us, to read them and to understand. It's nothing you immediately look at that and you say, yes, of course, it's clear. This is the kind of extra competence that is necessary within this kind of interdisciplinary settings. you need, of course, a kind of translational tool, because if we want to communicate this type of insights to a broader audience, let's say have a stakeholder conference with people from patient advocacies, we still have then perhaps make more efforts to explain what we did there. And I think this is still a next step. We would appreciate if we can follow up in this research project to build in now these very different value profiles again in this type of simulation, and then perhaps to use it for different type of devices and see how we go further, and then, so to say, to have this kind of proof of concept. So this is a bit what we want to share with you, and we're also looking forward for feedback and ideas how to bring this forward. But the main message is AI should not be only seen as a product or object of ethical reflection, but even it can contribute to a methodological approach. And I think this is where we just are in a very early phase. So we are curious what you think about.
Thank you, Mark and Silke, for these insights into the interdisciplinary collaboration within the IDEP project. I'm sure there are questions. The floor is open for questions. Yes, Stefan.
Yeah, I think in terms of these profiles, I think they map nicely onto the big five personality traits. So, for example, the person holding autonomy would map not 100% but very closely to openness and the extroversion dimension, for example, or the person valuing like privacy would load high on the neuroticism. And there are people.
Okay.
It's not a negative label in this sense. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if you could actually use this mapping to leverage your data, and also simply you would actually benefit from the sheer numbers which are behind the personality traits. Here we talk about hundreds of thousands of patients. And the other thing, you could also then have advantage of the observations which have been done in 10,000s of people, where there has been shown highly robust that there is a consistent change in the personality traits with aging in a direction towards more less openness, but more agreeableness, less neuroticism. So there is a strong literature behind this, which could actually leverage your results, which now are based on 20 or 40 people.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and that could be really a research forward. The only, I think that would be a kind of empirical question, in the sense that you really have to use these. I mean, you see already my reaction, this perhaps more the layperson reaction. I think some of these categories of these big five have kind of a very psychiatric labeling. And the question is whether they really match with moral categories. And the second point, and that's again an empirical question, whether that's what we can test, because what we have seen in our data is if you confront people with different case studies on this technology, it's not that the autonomy first person, so to say, does react to all offered technologies in the same way. So I think it's an empirical way, but I would be not so optimistic that it's just easy to replace these five and then we can spare this type of empirical research.
I wouldn't, but maybe it's not about replacing the ethical framing of the issue, but more about adding another layer of interpretation, so to speak, to the profiles, which is more of a psychological nature there, personality, how do you say, psychology of personality, so to speak. But I think what is really important is that we have to be careful not to psychologize ethical considerations and ethical arguments, because as we said, these value preference profiles for us are kind of extracted from arguments that people made in the interviews for or against a certain attitude towards a technology or a specific case. And in this sense, I think, as I said, it shouldn't be about replacing, but I don't think that's what you meant. It shouldn't be about psychologizing and replacing the ethical categories by psychological ones, but about adding more information about how these types are configured in a way. Yeah?
Next is a virtual question. Aaron Butler, please.
Yes, excuse me. Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I found the preliminary results of the initial study rather fascinating. I just have two quick questions. They're methodological in nature. Sorry, let me go ahead and lower my hand. Sorry. So the first is with respect to the respondent statements and value preference. One can, in giving an argument or expressing one's value statements, express ambivalence or even confusion with regard to their own self-knowledge regarding their value preferences. And in these reports, was that encountered and how was that dealt with? That's the first question. And the second is moving from the analysis of respondent statements to extrapolation of ethical reasoning. What were there interpretive limits in that regard, right? For example, just to, I guess, put it more plainly, one can read into someone else's arguments, right? And sort of misinterpret what one means, what one's value preferences are exactly insofar as they're being expressed in the arguments, especially in cases where one is ambivalent or confused about one's own preferences. So the two questions are related, of course. Thank you very much.
No, yeah, very valid points. Of course, in this kind of qualitative material, you encounter also ambivalences, and you encounter people pondering a certain questions and the pros and cons of a certain attitude and position. And there is a problem, I think, or a challenge, at least methodologically, of mapping these kinds of ambivalences into value preference profiles, which by their very definition aim for being clear and being kind of, leaving out the ambivalence there, because they then also would have to be operationalized, for example, and would have to be assigned with scores if you want to use them in a simulation experiment. So that's a challenge, I think, indeed, how to map or how to represent ambivalence in these profiles. And the other question that you had was, as far as I understood, a question of how to interpret this kind of empirical qualitative material and not kind of read into the material assumptions that you have. And of course, that's always the danger and in this kind of research, but there are, of course, methods, kind of, how do you say, there are very good and proven methods of qualitative analysis, content analysis, for example, that also work with working techniques like peer coding, for example, to check for intercoder reliability, which means that not one person conducts the interpretation of the qualitative material, but at least two or even more people code and interpret the same piece of interview, for example, and to check whether they arrive at different interpretations of an argument. And if so, this then challenges us to think again about the categories we use and the validity of our interpretations. So yes, in short, yes, the danger is there to kind of read into the material, but there are also methods and working techniques how to reduce this risk.
And perhaps there's one misunderstanding I wasn't clear about. What we do not propose here is to categorize all patients along these groups. But this is serving for the simulation to have a more, let's say, nuanced idea of how people can prioritize values and not just to have one or two values, which is, I think, in the past often the idea you have safety versus autonomy, and then privacy is a little bit below, but it can be even more complex. But one option could be, and that is what we also use, that people in practice could use this later on and could be added for self-categorization, which means you can offer people particular types and say, would you feel this would help you to characterize yourself? I mean, these types of ideas have been also discussed for using value profiles, for example, for doing advanced directives and helping people then to extrapolate in cases where people cannot express themselves anymore. So I think it's not totally out of the blue to have this idea that people can be categorized, but of course this can change over time, and that's another important point.
Thank you. Next question will be by Thomas Gissner.
My point is rather comment to the discussion around Stefan's remark. I mean, we have seen that these scores we compute are continuous when we vary an assistive strategy in a continuous domain, which then asks the question, and where is the optimum strategy? And these value profiles are a first step towards saying, okay, for different persons, the optimal point may be at different positions because they have a different preference order on the ethical values affected there. And it will be very interesting to see if these preference profiles, which are extracted by interview, also exist when we run, so to say, real-world experiments. And especially if these preference profiles are correlated with the big five, which are a different way to objectively measure the personal preferences. The one is extracting this from what people say, and the big five, I would assume, are rather expectations about what people then really do and experience. And it would be really interesting to contrast these two mechanisms for extracting information about the preference structure with respect to these ethical values. Short comment.
It's a helpful proposal how to deal with that in practice experiments.
Next question will be by Fabrice.
Yeah, I have a clarifying question. Mark, when you said we shouldn't psychologize morality or ethics, and I'm a little bit puzzled by this. And in the sense that there is more and more evidence now that there is an interaction between moral philosophy and moral psychology. And so it seems to me that the model or the tool you're proposing is very rationalistic. And by looking at the literature in moral psychology, you might have a fuller understanding of the idea of moral agency. And Tenzin, in the beginning of her talk, was saying, well, I'm confused. No philosopher can give me a definitive or a kind of satisfying definition of ethics or morality. But I think I think your project would benefit by going deeper. And I think this was your point. It seems to me that you are trying to push in, because when you talk about value profiling, why do we have the value we have? I think there is a psychology behind it. It's not just about principles and concepts, and there is the way we develop as more agents is more complex than that. And it seems to me that, so my question is, when you say, well, do you try to avoid psychologizing, or what is the role of moral psychology or the insights of moral psychology in what you try to do in this project?
Yeah. Good point, and gives the occasion maybe to clarify what I said or what I meant with this psychologizing comment. As I said, it's not about replacing the one through the other, neither replacing ethics through psychology, nor replacing psychology through rationalistic kind of ethics. But as I understood, Stefan, it's about adding an additional perspective that helps us understand how through, as you said, motivations, for example, through experiences, through biographical backgrounds and situations, these value preference profiles come into existence. But again, when I said I wouldn't want to psychologize them, I meant I wouldn't want to leave it only. I wouldn't want to leave it on the psychological level. I think the moral philosophical level that asks for the validity of values and prioritizations and asks for arguments why a certain prioritization of values is better or not so good from the point of view of a certain person. That's an important level that should not be completely kind of reduced to a psychological level. So I'm against reductionism in both directions. I think we need both, and the question how they are to be connected, of course, there's a challenge there.
If I may quickly, but you seem to make a hierarchy between, arguments versus more psychology, or are they on par in the way you understand and define morality?
Perhaps I can step here in, but I think it's a very complicated debate. I mean, it's a long-standing debate how moral psychology helps us to understand development of moral values and categorizations and so on. I mean, Kohlberg, Gilligan, and beyond this is very few studies, unfortunately. But I think it's really important to understand that kind of moral psychology can help, is still a way of rationalization, because it often gives types of reasons why people are this type, or how they have learned it, and what they do fear. And in this sense, I think it can saturate perhaps these type of profiles. But and you can use it if you combine empirical research, like what we did, where you have people exposing to case studies, and then you would combine it, for example, with biographical interviews. There are a couple of methodologies, I fully agree, and that would be a really important research point. But I would still say that for building an ethical reflection on where should we need regulating stuff, what does engineers need to know, how moral values can be much more complex. I'm not sure it has the super added value you are proposing by the idea it's rational only to work with value profiles. You know what I mean?
Yeah, as you said, it's a complex discussion, but to what extent, in a sense, how people make more judgments, it's not only based on cognitive dimensions. You have more emotions that interact, the cognitive and the affective interact.
So this is actually, I mean, I don't know how often you do empirical research with patients. When you do empirical research with patients, it is not rational like what philosophers do, sitting in an armchair and thinking, okay, these are the 5 values and we have to deal with this. Because in this material already, there is already a lot of, so to say, phenomenological, biographical experience, and we often use this in a lot of studies. And I'm very open, and we even have this. I mean, I haven't presented it, but of course, when you provide more detailed insight why people or this person, even if she says she is an autonomy-driven or prioritized person, she might still have in particular cases her personal biographical or even phenomenological shared experience with a particular technology. And of course you should take this into account when it comes to concrete offering technology to this person. But I think for generalizing ethical reflection, and this is what we are here proposing, I think this always works more on an individual level and how you interact with an individual patient. But I'm not sure this would really add so much to this expert debate we have, what we had today, for example.
But, and then this will be my last word. I think we just got some interviews we did for a different project, but we realized we tried to look at cues where it's not just about principles or the cognitive dimension, but even when we transcribe the interviews, we try to have cues that reflect this affective dimension, and you can do it. So it's all what I'm saying is it seems to me that it's a little eyes on the cognitive dimension. So I'm wondering to what extent maybe I don't know enough about the product for sure. So, but this is my.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, sorry. Please continue this.
Yeah.
It calls for more discussion.
Yes, yeah, you're right.
So,
you're doing well.
That would be your opinion.
Yeah, I have a quick remark on the one hand, and that is in your interviews, I don't think that you assess, or do you assess the reasoning, or do you assess the action? For the simulation, you need the action. The action is, as we learned yesterday, action-oriented. Yeah, that is one thing. The second thing I just want to briefly mention to this debate here, and that is what was suggested is basically that one linear system maps onto another potentially linear system. There are very simple mathematical methods to see whether there is a mapping, whether it explains something or not. This is a truly empirical question. Yeah, just assess both and simultaneously see if you find a mapping. And yeah, so this question with the reasoning versus the, you know, what follows in practice? Is this the action? Is this the reasoning?
I think you can even consider the stakeholder model. I don't know, can I share again the slide? So in the stakeholder model, of course, you can feed in both. I mean, you can feed data, how people have actually behaved, for example, when they are oriented or disoriented, or if they interact. And you can, of course, add insights of how people would prioritize particular values depending on what the thing do. And then still, of course, this does not replace empirical research, then still observing what people do additionally. But I think the idea is here that we can somehow, and this is perhaps a more provocative statement, what we observe in the field currently is too many things, technologies are now developed and then thrown into care facilities, and then people realize, that's people don't like it and so on. And I think, so this type of methodology would at least be a pre-stage, and that could, improve, so to say, when you will go into situ. But of course you need this still, because you still might have ambivalence is what people think they do, and then in practice they are confronted with this technology. And this again, I think, should be more than just one word, than just social acceptance studies. But I think then also you have, for example, phenomenological approaches like participatory observation. People might say, I don't have a problem with this technology, you know, but then in practice they often circumvent it, or they shut it down, and there are a lot of interesting studies, like small studies, and that could add, so to say, to the way how we often think, what kind of person would I like to be, also morally, and what kind of person I am in this concrete situation. And again, I think this is a kind of method mix that is necessary to get more insight on that.
Yes. I think mine would be more a methodological question. If a participant said different things, how would we do the profiling? So, you know, in one case, it's privacy versus autonomy. In somewhere else, there's another value. So how would we?
I mean, the idea is not, this is perhaps why I'm also a bit skeptical to the idea that you can be categorized along the big five, for example. But the idea is you do the profiling is context related. So it depends on the IIT you are asking about. And that's why I'm saying I could imagine people who are really in favor of perhaps a robot because of their biographical or, I don't know, childhood experience. They have a very fond memory and an emotional relationship. They are Star Wars fans and they love RD2D and so on. But they hate, for example, the idea that there is a shower robot. And I think that's why I'm a bit, and it's another idea from empirical research on other ethical topics. I think dealing with ethical issues does not work. You are just this one person, but it's really context related. So value profiles should be related to a particular case. And here this work material they analyzed mainly to the orientation, disorientation guidance via technology. Does it explain it to you?
Yes, perfectly, because we obviously have collected similar data, and I'm wondering, whenever your paper is published, please share so that we can substantiate if we can also like profile based on different technology, because we have response based on technology, sensors, robots, and to see.
That would be interesting even to share the data and see how, like in a follow-up research, to use even a larger data set which was collected in a different setting, and then perhaps even finding that there are overlaps with strengthening, of course, the findings on both sides.
One more question by Andreas.
It's just more a comment towards your comment about extending our models. I think one thing is quite important. So using simulations in complex design processes is a thing in engineering. So if you design an aircraft, then of course you need simulation because you cannot only do experimental research. It's too expensive. So it's similar like this. And from the pragmatic point of view, you start with very simple models at the beginning. So because of computational power, it's limited. And of course, you do not know exactly what kind of extension of those models, which kind of refinements of those models are really necessary. Because the only thing at the end, what is relevant is how accurate we are able to predict something. Of course, this has to be matched to empirical measurements. And then, of course, step by step, usually you extend the models. The human models, models of assistant systems, and so on and so on. You refine this, and it becomes more and more complex. But, of course, the only thing is, does it work at the end? So is accuracy increased? And so, therefore, my engineering answer is very simple. Try it, and then we will see.
That's another project.
Of course.
Yes, that's obvious. I mean, it's a comment, and it can stand for itself. Just a brief comment back. The pragmatic aspect is very important. There is a pragmatic argument for this. It facilitates certain things, but it's not the only thing. It's also an enhanced, a technologically enhanced form of thought experiment, which kind of assists us in ethical reflection and in imagining a whole range of possible scenarios, more than we as limited human thinkers.
This is called in other domains in silicon experiments. So this is in silicon experiment.
In silicon is beautiful.
Yeah.
We'll take that.
Very quick comment on that. Andreas, I'm only partly with you. That is, if we take this as if we also take this as a tool for inference and reasoning, then we are not only at the level of a black box AI that produces an output, but we are at the level of an interpretable AI. And then we have to ask how many degrees of freedom we have in the design, and whether this design that we currently analyze that produces that behavior that we want to have, if we have alternative implementations for that would produce the same behavior, and which of them should we take this as a plurality of solutions? Should we focus on certain solutions to produce it? I mean, that's this good old simple thing that was a good action, but for the wrong reasons.
No, your argument that maybe we should discuss whether there are reasons or actions. This is valid, of course. Okay.
So it sounds like the setup was thought-provoking lunch break now. So thanks again to Mark and Silke for...
Thanks for your helpful questions. We will think about it. Then follow up.
participating and have a great lunch break.
Yeah, now we have lunch over there, and then after lunch at 2:00, we appreciate if we will all meet in the hall, and then we have a post session.
Okay, we have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Clara Berridge. She's an associate professor and Catrin Hall Chambers Scholar in the School of Social Work at the University of Washington, Seattle, where she is adjunct associate professor in the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance and core faculty in the Disability Study Program. In her research, she focuses on ethical and policy implications of data-intensive technologies for elder care and how to promote social technical practices in ways that do not marginalize, isolate, or diminish their participants. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to share my slide. So good afternoon. I regret that I can't join you in person today, primarily because I didn't catch the previous two presentations. So I'll have to leave it to you to raise some contradictions or overlaps between what I'm about to present and what's been said today. So I look forward to our discussion. And because it is 6 in the morning here in Seattle, you're likely to see me get increasingly animated as my caffeine kicks in. I have a wonderful multidisciplinary team, and I'm listing people here who I've co-authored with over the recent years on studies that I'll touch on today. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose, and I'm currently funded by the United States National Institutes of Health's Institute on Aging. So as you are likely all aware, the dissemination of technologies that passively collect and transmit personal data is outpacing our understanding of how to help families, how to help care workers, and how to help facilities, such as nursing homes, assisted living, and even policymakers think about and involve older adults in decisions about how they want to be monitored. There's a lot of work to be done. Older adults continue to be digitally marginalized and are more prone to misperceptions about data flows. Digital technologies collect, analyze, store, and transmit information about a person that wasn't previously collected in the same way or as frequently. So important questions include, how much does one understand about, for example, what sensors the residential facility is using or that their adult child has installed in their home? Do they understand when continuous data collection is occurring and who's receiving it and for what purpose? We know that older adults are not likely to be the party driving an adoption decision about care technologies used with them or on them, whether they're living with dementia or not. This means that we need to bring some intentional focus to the needs of people living with dementia when we think about technology use that is ethical. Research on decision-making about care preferences in general shows that people living with mild to moderate stages of dementia are capable of making decisions about or expressing their preferences, yet they're not often engaged in decisions about their care. This is a problem and a dynamic that certainly extends beyond technology decisions, but it makes it all the more important to think about processes and implications of decision-making for technology use when an individual may be less likely to be consulted. The practices that develop around monitoring technologies can negatively impact older adults, where greater exercise of power over aspects of their lives is authorized. For instance, an ethnography I have cited here of dementia care dyads revealed ways in which using sensors and fall detectors led caregivers to unnecessarily restrict movement and remove privileges, as well as reduce their personal visits. Ethicists and gerontologists like myself have cautioned that older adults may be vulnerable to infringements on self-determination through these technology practices. We're also interested, of course, in the ways in which decision-making that is increasingly based on AI monitoring may intensify power and control. Some underlying issues are that the ethics research 10 to 15 years ago, which is when I started studying technology, has been slow to emerge. I think particularly in the United States, probably. I remember in about 2012, when I was a doctoral student, before I had my own research to present, I wanted to have a symposium at the Gerontological Society of America, and I could not identify enough US scholars focusing on ethics in gerontechnology to fill a symposium. Fortunately, there had been a lot more work among European colleagues, and the conference was in Southern California in November, so panelists were willing to make the trip to the States. But the ethics conversation hasn't kept pace with the developments in technology. Obviously, that focus on ethics is stronger now in academia, but despite these gains, there's a translation gap between that work and real-world implementation, policy, or practice. Engagement with ethics has also been a problem in design. Marcello Jenka found in a recent review that most dementia care technologies have been developed without consideration of any ethical principles. This is unlikely to surprise anyone, but it's striking given how shot through with ethical issues dementia care is. And others have worked to unveil the value-laden decisions made by designers that become naturalized, and for many reasons related to political economy, unquestionably the right thing to do. And with product development and marketing targeted on those providing care, the caregivers, the needs and desires of older adults, and particularly older adults living with dementia, have not been prioritized. So let's look for a minute at the issue of control. I recently surveyed 900 people over the age of 50 about their comfort with a range of care technologies, from location tracking for safety to telepresence, to artificial companions. And by artificial companions, I mean social robots that use natural language processing. And then I asked how important these options would be. As shown on this table from left to right, they could select not at all important all the way to extremely important. If you look at the percentages of people who selected important or extremely important, it's pretty clear that these control and participation options matter to people when they're thinking about technologies used in their future care. The percentage of people who felt that pausing a technology is an option that is important or extremely important is a full 94. The sample is not living with dementia. It includes about 200 people who reported having concerns about their memory or having been seen by a doctor about memory concerns. So these options are not generally what older adults are getting in technologies designed to support aging in place or care. There's a disconnect. Not only do we have a translation gap between research and practice and policy, but opportunities for control that could support more empowering use are not even designed into the devices themselves. So it's not as simple as saying to practitioners or to family members, social workers, et cetera, make sure the older adult is aware that they hit this button to pause the device when they want privacy. It'll automatically turn back on with a reminder beep in an hour. That button hasn't been designed in. When I present findings from studies with older adults who are not living with dementia, the most common discussion question is, but when people are living with dementia, isn't this all out the window? So hang on to these findings because I'm going to present findings about the same set of options for a group of people living with Alzheimer's disease at the end of my presentation to begin to address that. We clearly need the ethics and values research to be translated into design and practice and policy, but I'd argue that we also need more focus specifically on power. One reason we need this is that surfaced in my research and others' research is because the surveilling nature of some of these technologies and the power caregivers, for example, can have over their care partner can also put important values and family members themselves in tension with one another. So beyond what are the ethical aspects and implications of these technologies in dementia care, let's ask more directly, how are our technologies amplifying or addressing power imbalances, both social power structures and interpersonal power dynamics? Dr. Burmeister, who presented yesterday, writes about power in design for older adults and has explained that product design, too, needs to be clear about the exercise of power. They write, for the technological designer, it should always be as intentional as possible, rather than allowing power to be exercised in an intuitive or unconscious manner. I think that's been discussed in presentations on value-sensitive design methods. Now, ethical debate is not only about values, it should also be about how we account for certain non-ideal facts about the world. My brilliant University of Washington colleague at the I School, the Information School, Anna Lauren Hoffman, reminds us that, quote, doing ethics will mean attending to histories, dynamics, and relationships that exceed any given tool or technology. These non-ideal facts she references in our context include the fact that not everyone is capable of giving informed consent or opting out of use. Oppression is a non-ideal fact of the world, which is visible in structural ageism and ableism, and how that plays out in opportunities for care and ways of relating to people living with dementia. Paternalism certainly characterizes a lot of dementia care, but so does abandonment. The problem that may be particularly pervasive in the US is having limited options to get needed support. That's certainly disempowering. And as Navin and Payne have shown in their 2017 discourse analysis, and this idea of the triple win that they raise, digital technologies, particularly those that offer constant monitoring, are sold under the umbrella of resource scarcity that acts to foreclose questions about conditions of scarcity to begin with. And while I'm about to turn to the problem of unbalanced interpersonal power dynamics that can disempower people in relation to decisions about how they are monitored, largely framing this problem as one of control and consent, it's apparent that that is only one of many nuts to crack towards ethical implementation, particularly when we see more impersonal implementation processes, such as how residential institutions and organizations are implementing digital technologies and AI, and also wrapping in surveillance of low-wage workers in these spaces. Power should be front and center. Elisa Grigorovich in Canada and I have a paper coming out in a special issues in Frontiers in Sociology, co-edited by Stephen Katz, where we attempt to articulate potential algorithmic harms of surveillance technologies, including AI, in the nursing home context in the US and Canada. So my point is, I'm going to focus on control and consent. But in some ways, those may be the easiest challenges relative to more structural power dynamics. Let's turn to what's at stake when values are put in tension. We know technology isn't value neutral, that ethical issues are often veiled in marketing, and that values are discussed in popular and tech discourse in terms of independence and safety and privacy, without room for nuance in what those ideas mean to people. Digging deeper into this issue of control, we know it matters to older adults, but it's important to understand why control over how technology is used in their care matters. Well, sometimes their primary support person, a caregiver, an adult child, even a spouse, doesn't know or share their preferences. Studies have found differences between older adults and family members with regard to perception of need and comfort with the collection of various levels of data granularity and different ways of balancing risks and benefits. Research also indicates that families and frontline workers have difficulty understanding how to navigate these decisions in a way that respects the values held by older adults who the technology would be used with or on. For example, in a dyadic study of Meals on Wheels clients and their primary family support person, adult children and their parents often expressed conflicting views about how and when three technologies, location tracking, in-home sensors, and web cameras should be used. And the more potentially invasive the technology, the more likely a disagreement. The camera was a technology that caused the most within dyad disagreement, with more than half of the dyads expressing opposing views, always the older adult not wanting the technology. Adult children felt that involving their parents in conversations and decisions about whether to use these kinds of technologies would be complicated, underestimated their capacity to understand the basic function of the technologies, and most felt that they would involve parents minimally. Their parents, by contrast, who rated each technology less favorably, wanted to be involved in those decisions and made aware of technologies used in their care. So even in this case, when older parents are living at home and capable of giving consent, in the study, people were not living with dementia, adult children reported that they may judge it easier to install a monitoring device without discussion to avoid potential conflict. Adult children also widely perceived that they had the ability to persuade their parents to adopt. They expected initial resistance and eventual acceptance. This mirrors Lewis Navin's work on the paternalistic framing of older adults, initial versus real resistance to technology. In some cases, adult children predicted conflicting views, stating, for example, my mother would hate that and I would love it. And as a caregiver, I want it, but if I were my mom, I would not. Families are facing tricky decision-making dynamics, but so are frontline workers who face different challenges depending on what their role is. I've done some work on Medicaid here in the United States and decisions about these technologies. And recently, well, not recently anymore, a year ago, I was presenting for Adult Protective Services in the state of Washington and use that as an opportunity to informally poll them. Adult Protective Services here is the service that investigates reports of abuse, abandonment, neglect, exploitation of vulnerable adults, a category that includes sometimes older adults with conditions that impact cognition or with dementia. So I surveyed 42 investigators from my state's APS about their observations of surveillance technologies and their concerns. And these are the technologies in order of how many APS investigators said they're seeing these technologies in the field when they go into people's homes and investigate a report of abuse. Web cameras, unsurprisingly, they're pretty ubiquitous. Sensors on doors or windows, and then other forms of sensors. So in APS, investigators have the added consideration of the role of privacy in their work to protect vulnerable people in tricky power dynamics. Privacy and confidentiality, which surveillance technologies, if used by an abuser, could undermine. Among their top concerns are the problem of consent. I have that bolded. Other response options that aren't listed here because no one selected them are an individual living in a facility or adult family home wants a surveilling device in their living space and isn't being permitted to have one. And a non-related paid caregiver covers up or thwarts use of a surveilling device. So those were offered and nobody selected those. So that informal poll and some of the studies I touched on all raise similar key questions. How should technologies be presented to older adults to enable informed participation in decisions and appreciation for what a given technology would mean for their lives? These are just some of the many questions as we look to integrate technologies in ways that people could experience as empowering. And in particular, we need to understand how to navigate this when dementia is present. In order to get to actionable answers to these questions, we first need to identify what technologies to focus on. So what specific types of technologies and data collection are relevant now in dementia home care? And then another need underscored by the ethics research is a clear understanding of their potential risks and benefits. In the Meals on Wheels dyad study, people spoke especially to privacy threats and needing to feel free in their own home, whereas adult children put more weight on safety than autonomy. So what values are put in tension? What are the risks and what's at stake for whom? And then of course, what strategies are needed to mitigate those risks? We conducted a survey of experts in germ technology from academia and industry in the States and Canada to learn where to focus efforts for the near term and ultimately to foster practices in the home that families can feel good about. So we asked them about dementia care technologies used specifically in the home. And these were 21 domain experts. I sought a balanced mix of people with specific expertise in technology for older adults from industry, people who had strong knowledge of AI and gerontology and related social sciences. The Delphi technique is used to solicit experts' opinions and to build consensus. It's a multi-survey process. It's a process of gathering information, refining it, and getting agreement in the final responses. So people come to consensus. They kind of land on the final response. So in this case, categories of technologies that this group predicts will be most common in the next 5 years for dementia care, and they identified 12. I'll let you take in this list. I combined some of them to fit on the slide. So location tracking inside the home as well as outside of the home. And many technologies here focus on risk management, predicting health events, and most but not all introduce new forms of monitoring by collecting new data more often. You'll see they have two forms of AI, a virtual agent or socially assistive robot for non-human companionship. And then they broke that into, using, for example, Alexa to stimulate engagement and connection with the outside world. So that used to check the weather, sports, play music, etc. They distinguish between the two uses. So then domain experts were asked to identify, of those 12 technologies, which were the most likely to require a conversation with an older adult before use. So which technologies could cause the most conflict if used without permission, maybe which could be experienced as most invasive, And these are the practices that rose to the top of that list. So we have recording audio to detect cognitive change and monitor socialization, video conferencing when you, such as like a telepresence robot that allows the caregiver to beam in without getting permission to enter, which practically makes a lot of sense, especially for someone living with dementia, because you don't want to require that they know where the robot is. And generally somebody wants to beam in order to check on somebody. Location tracking again, and then using specifically the AI virtual agent or socially assisted robot for non-human companionship. And then physiological variable monitoring. Domain experts were then asked to specify the prominent risks and benefits of each, and the aggregated risks across these technologies were fed back to the experts to identify ways to mitigate each of those risks. And I'll present across 4 slides the aggregated most common risks across these 12 technologies, because I don't have time to dive into each technology. Each technology had 5 to 12 risks and 5 to 12 benefits associated with each, and we present all of those in table 2 of the paper listed here if you're interested in diving deeper. But among the aggregated most common risks, number 1 is privacy threat. They can also cause uncomfortable feelings, either from feeling like one isn't free in their home to do as they please, feeling babysat, or feeling that there's no place to hide. Those can lead to fear, paranoia, depression, or anxiety. Information or alert overload and caregiver fatigue were cited as likely to make caregivers anxious. Other commonalities across technologies included a false sense of security. When a caregiver feels they are getting the monitoring information they need through technology, it could lead to fewer check-ins to the detriment of the older adult. Experiencing harassing questioning by caregivers and not being given room to deviate from routine were commonly cited risks. Older adults changing behavior to conform, which is actually something I've observed happening in practice in earlier research on sensor use and actual use. And finally, participants voiced concern that recordings that lead to knowledge of non-adherence or high-risk activities could in turn lead to increased premiums. I'm referring to healthcare premiums or denial of healthcare coverage. This may be potentially of greater concern in the US with privatized and a capitalist healthcare system. Concern over the security of audio and other data types was another of these common issues. Participants emphasized both security risks and nefarious use as unresolved problems. They noted the idea of big data collection being needed without much knowledge for where it may end up. And other studies have found that older adults tend to be more concerned about third-party use of their data than our younger adults. So the domain experts' suggestions to mitigate the most commonly raised risks are categorized as follows. It's clear that there's no catch-all solution and that intentional choice needs to be made to address these risks at multiple levels. Some are issues that could be mitigated by making different design choices or designing in new options for the user, integrating value-sensitive design, while others, such as security, may be best addressed through regulatory choices. I'm going to focus on the latter 2 that are highlighted now, but in the paper we provide their detailed suggestions within each of these categories. Nearly all participants emphasized the need for control to be offered to older adults and their families in the use of design of these technologies for dementia care. They're speaking to a clear need for personalized options and ways to actually enable them. And I think this last bullet point here, provide alternative options to enable actual choice about use, is huge. It's not voluntary and non-coercive if it's the only option offered, or if it's an ultimatum. You know, if it's this or a nursing home, that's not quite a fair choice. There may be consent in that situation, but it doesn't make it an ethical process where choices that are that constrained. They also suggested establishing informed consent as a process rather than a one-time event so people could revisit their use. And Julie Robillard has written pretty extensively about designing ethical design for dementia and including consent as a process. It's hard to fully predict how a technology will be experienced in practice. Business models could offer trial periods to rent to own options that spread payment risk over time to give time to try it out. Whatever model might be used, it should be based on the expectation that we don't know how people will interact with or experience a given technology until they try it. So high initial fees lock people in and should be avoided. Opt-out policies where the default is use should also be avoided. And this is something we see here more in residential settings where every room is outfitted with the sensor system and older adults are not necessarily consulted about whether or not they want to use it. These suggestions, often offered by domain experts, align well with other research that shows the importance of tailoring tech to each individual. And both Drs. Fisher and Burmeister yesterday spoke to the importance of personalizing tools. People have diverse preferences and are differently socially positioned. And so decision-making support might be most effective when directed where the negotiation of these preferences and values occurs. Research has demonstrated the need for tools to support education, awareness, and decision-making about technologies used to support care, including forward-looking consent processes before dementia undermines informed preference formation or expression. I've developed and piloted a self-administered intervention for people living with mild dementia and their family or friend care. I use the term care partner. I'm not sure how widespread that use is in Germany, but when I say care partner now, I'm referring to the caregiver. So this intervention is called Let's Talk Tech, and it's responsive to this need to educate families about the technology's risks and benefits, the pros and cons, in a way that is meaningful to them so that they can appreciate what it might be like to use it, and to engage people living with dementia in decision-making. The intervention's purpose is to facilitate communication and preference formation and sharing of the person living with dementia's preferences, similar to what's been developed, in advanced care planning. So this is in the form of a web app that consists of education about 4 categories of technologies, 7 technologies total, that collect diverse data. So location tracking, in-home activity sensing in various locations in the home web cameras, and artificial companion robots, those that use natural language processing to talk and listen. It requires no trained professional, but it does require that at least 2 people sit down together using an internet-connected device to complete it. Let's Talk Tech guides the dyad through a discussion of what technologies the person living with dementia might want and under what conditions they would want them to be used. And I want to take a minute to link this work to the conversation yesterday. I think it's a conversation that ended yesterday's discussion about the difficulties identifying universal values, whether that be safety or dignity, and the idea that we should develop robots that seize Americans' guns. I'm just kidding. See if you're still awake. That achievement and prioritizing of values may be differently expressed because they're cultural commitments and they must be contextualized. I'm actually a really big fan of some of the critical data and information studies scholarship outside of gerontology happening in fields of critical race, feminist, and disability studies. And Anna Lauren Hoffman, who I cited earlier, who's the co-author on the Feminist Data Manifest No, that I recommend if you haven't checked it out, posits that refusal could be a universal feminist value, refusal. And she makes a compelling case. To the extent that all people's values and concerns are not yet taken into consideration, and maybe can't be, in the design or implementation of technologies that involve personal data collection, I think refusal is a value worth enabling as one counterforce against disempowering practices. One of many things this intervention I developed does is enable and create space for a person with dementia to assert refusal or to lay boundaries, as well as to, help the caregiver feel at ease using a given technology that they are comfortable with. These are the primary outcomes I targeted with Let's Talk Tech. We wanted to improve the care partner's knowledge of the person living with dementia's preferences. We wanted the care partner to report that they feel more prepared to make decisions about technology use. And we wanted to improve their comprehension and their understanding of each of the technologies. And then importantly, because we know that a care partner's perception of the person living with dementia's comprehension of the technology is going to impact their willingness to involve them or take their preferences seriously, we wanted care partners to perceive improved understanding by the person living with dementia of the technologies. And then we also hope to move mutual understanding. I feel heard, I feel understood, these kinds of questions. So what were we able to move with the pilot study with 29 dyads with people living with mild Alzheimer's disease and a caregiver? We had statistically significant improvements on most of our measures. There were a lot of unknowns going into this. Can we effectively describe technologies to people living with mild dementia via words and icons? Can we get dyads to sit down together to complete a roughly 45-minute intervention on their own? Because the human-computer interaction research on web app development for dementia is still limited, we weren't even sure that our interface and design and accessibility choices would work. So will people get more stressed out learning about the pros and cons, including the surveilling nature of these technologies? Or would it provoke conflict and increase anxiety to talk about it when we're trying to ease caregiver stress? So the very positive feasibility findings and these preliminary efficacy findings are exciting because they show that these challenges can be overcome. The preliminary findings from this pilot are going to inform a clinical trial to determine if this intervention could inexpensively scale, does indeed have the desired impact on these range of outcomes. And through longitudinal research, we'll measure actual goal concordant care. So does the caregiver actually adhere to the preferences or continue to consult the person when they make decisions? But the pilot efficacy findings are not the reason I'm describing this work. What I want to do is give you the context for the actual documented preferences these 29 people living with mild Alzheimer's disease in this study expressed in this advanced care planning process, because I think that these expressions of preferences are probably a bit more valid than would be a typical acceptance study, because this is a process they're doing with their care partner. The researcher's not present, and they are literally planning for what they would want and communicating that to their care partner. So more thought goes into it, perhaps more realistic preferences. Because so much of the research is on the preferences and perceptions of older adults who are not experiencing dementia. I think this is interesting. So this table is just the first 16 of the 29 people living with dementia's preferences, because they didn't all fit on one slide. But I'm showing you this because it displays the diversity of technology preferences by participant. Each participant is a row. The N means no, they do not want to use that technology. The Y means yes, they do. And the U means, unsure. Our findings indicate that people living with dementia's desire for digital technologies used to monitor them and support their care is not necessarily consistent across devices or data collection purposes. Preferences were very much technology specific. No participant desired all of the featured technologies, and only one rejected them across the board, which supports an understanding that preferences will intersect with personal circumstances, needs, values, and negotiations within families. So while there were diverse preferences across participants, overall, there were more no responses to technology options than yes or unsure responses. And we also got a sense of their values. So we asked them privacy, continuing to live where I live, feeling free, and safety. We asked them to sort of rate the importance of these values. And we actually found no relationship between how they asserted those values, the importance of those values, and their technology preferences. So I think it's also interesting that just because somebody says that safety is very important to them or privacy is very important to them doesn't dictate what they're going to want in terms of these technologies. I think that's interesting. Also, we didn't have a lot of variation. Everyone felt that all of those values were quite important. This is the number of people who wanted each option presented to them, and it includes both the 7 featured technologies and the alternative support options. Because remember from the domain expert study that it's not a fair choice if monitoring technology is the only feasible option. So we asked them about other options they might want. And with the exception of location tracking, the featured technologies ranked far lower in desirability than other options. More phone calls with friends or families was the most selected of these, followed closely by wearing a medical alert bracelet, more social outings and activities with other people, and more frequent visits by others. The featured technologies are highlighted in blue. Some care partners commented in interviews about how access to these other desirable supports aren't within their power to control. That is, families and friends may not be available or willing to help with these activities. These findings suggest need for continued efforts to support dementia education with the general population and normalize friendship with people living with dementia, possibly through programs like here. I don't know if you have Momentia in Germany, but Dementia Friends, dementia-friendly communities, and other innovative programs. And it further points to the importance of learning how to support care partners to access social and respite support. They were also presented with control options, as I promised earlier in my presentation, and asked if they would want each. And you'll see that these all tend to be desired, highly desired by our participants with mild Alzheimer's disease. So these are very similar control options, worded slightly different than those that I presented earlier with a population that does not live with dementia. So to know, to be aware, if a technology is being used, to be given the opportunity to change one's mind, to stop using, and to be able to pause. So I'll show you the slide I presented earlier because those findings align strongly with the responses from the larger survey of people that examine the importance of very similar options. You'll see that these ideas are pretty important to this larger group. The current study's finding, albeit based on a much smaller sample of only 29, indicates that enabling control and privacy options, even in technologies for use with dementia care, may be very important for person-centered care. So the question I'll end on is the next logical question. How are we going to enable this? I think this is being discussed actively at this event. How do we enable more control, informed use, more tailored options for people living with dementia? And how can those aspects be adapted as someone's condition progresses? And I'll leave you with my contact information, and then we can discuss.
Any questions? Yeah.
Yes, thanks a lot, Clara. It's amazing to see how your data resonates and somehow even, so to say, repeats also studies being conducted in other countries. So I think it's a really strong material basis to take all these concerns very serious. I like to go back again about the main question I think you posed in the beginning, namely about power relations. And and for me, I think it's very important to understand power relations not only between somehow implicit technology imposing power on humans, but specifically in care communities, the power relations between humans. And I think the beginning of your talk, you make your really strong points, often are undermined or overseen by the thinking that care relatives are the perfect proxy, so to say, to get an understanding what people with dementia want or do not want. However, at the very end of your talk, I was wondering with the survey and so what actually would be the implications again for rethinking or being more critical towards this power relationship, because I felt a bit that the survey is showing that people want to have the power to refuse technology, to put it in a nutshell, whether you pause it or you stop it. It's again only focusing on the implicit power of the technology, so to say, but it does not point out again to the conflicts that may arise out of the fact that somebody at home pauses this camera, and then this daughter comes once a week and sees, oh mom, what you did, why did you pause this camera? It's very important. This puts a lot of stress on me because then I think something has happened. I mean, we can all imagine that these are real conversations taking place. So can you a bit comment on that? So where's again this the human power relationship in this data or how does this link together?
Yeah, great question and points. Absolutely. So the intervention that I developed is limited, and it's very limited in terms of the technology. It doesn't dive deeper into power relations. But one thing that we hope it does, and one thing that we learned from the exit interviews that we think it does, is it helps the care partner or the caregiver see the person's perspective, because it's a discussion generating tool. So they're prompted to talk with each other. How would you feel about using this given technology and why? And the person living with dementia is prompted to speak first, so they're not unduly influenced by the caregiver's preferences. And so when we interview care partners, they expressed that this gave them a chance to iron things out. They negotiated their plans for technology use, and they better understood and could put themselves in the shoes of the person living with dementia, could understand where they're coming from with regard to need for privacy, for example, or that privacy intrusion could actually impact how free one feels or could impact their autonomy. Because, care partners are tired often and, very much thinking about solutions and may not have that opportunity to have that conversation. A lot of people said, this gave us an opportunity to have a hard conversation, and it was uncomfortable, but it was worth it. And it's a conversation we knew we needed to have, but we didn't know how. So the goal is to get them to talk about it, to get care partners to start to understand the other person's perspective, to see that there may be a different perspective there. But it does not extend into, what happens when some of these options are actually enabled and the caregiver doesn't like it, or that it raises questions, or the restrictions on the monitoring or surveillance causing tension itself. We just don't get there. And I think there's so many creative potential solutions in design, but I also think, my goal in this very limited intervention is to create, by having this intervention, it signals to people that this actually is a conversation you need to have, that it actually is the right thing to do, perhaps, to engage the person living with dementia. And it raises questions and conversations in a way that I think helps shift the conversation towards, okay, and this is something that should be involved in advanced care planning, that I should be checking in with people about before they're unable to participate. But it's very limited, as most interventions are. Does anybody else have ideas about answering that question, or ideas for how to go further?
Perhaps I can just add on that. I think the idea to use advanced care directives, we heard it in a citizen conference, and our own students found it in a couple of studies. So I think this is really important point that should be made much stronger, because I think it has yet not really entered the healthcare context. So I agree with you. I think that at least starting conversations is at least a minimum, and that could be much easier facilitated than perhaps people think it can, but it might not solve really the moral dilemma that's behind all this. That's what I think.
Absolutely not. No. And one thing we're trying to do for the next iteration is to enable secure sharing of the preference document that the web app creates. It's kind of like a Mad Lib where it fills in, I would want this under this condition. So you have this documented preference set that could be then shared with, for example, other adult children, or the spouse if the adult children are the ones who did it, or a social worker or a neurologist, so that other professionals and other people could not only avoid conflict with each other about the use of technology, but support the care partner to find technologies that might work, or alternatives. We have I say alternatives. We didn't present them as alternatives. You can have more family visits, certainly, as well as location tracking used with you. But we're hoping that might help sort of spread the word about the person's preferences.
Thank you. So we have another question in the room, 2 questions in the room, and one question online by Gerhard Fischer.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if you could say a little bit more about the concrete design of your intervention, because it sounds somehow like a miracle that you really can bring people to talk about something they always wanted to talk about, but actually never did. I mean, if you had such a device, it would solve many problems in interhuman relationships. So I'm surprised. I would very much be interested to learn about the actual device you use for that.
Yeah, so I can refer you to the first paper that's out now in JMIR Aging on the feasibility, and it describes the design of the intervention itself. I can't share it with you right now because it's under wraps for research purposes, but basically we used a multi-research stage to arrive at the content. So we did multiple studies, surveys, both of older adults and caregivers and domain experts. The domain expert study informed this this intervention because we identified the prominent risks and benefits. And so when we talk about each technology, we present each technology using vignettes, which I've used in past research and found successful. I'll just give you an example of ways, and this isn't how we use it in this technology, but in interviewing research and communicating. So when I want to talk to an older adult who's living with dementia or isn't necessarily about a sensor, and they don't have a reference for what a sensor is, I will say something, I will make it familiar. So I will say, do you know how you walk into the drugstore or the grocery store, and when you walk up to it, the door opens automatically for you? That's the same idea. It's a motion sensor. It knows when you're there, right? It's not a camera, but it knows. So these kinds of making it familiar, giving people a reference. And I think that's an emerging best practice within HCI design too. But there's very limited work on dementia design in HCI. And I think that's a strong area for growth, especially ways to titrate and to adjust as people's conditions progress. Accessibility too, I'll note we used audio. I would say we had this little ear icon where you could click it and have the words on the screen be read. And that was very valuable because reading it can help a person living with dementia focus and stay tuned in. It also gives the caregiver a break from reading. So that's one accessibility feature that people reported was really useful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the insights in your research. And did I understand you correctly that you didn't find any correlation between value preferences and preferences regarding technology use? And I was wondering if that maybe also points to the fact that people not only have different value preferences, but maybe also conceptualize the values very differently. Just because we as researchers might think a person values privacy a lot, that they probably reject using a location tracker, but they might also think, I value my privacy so much, so I don't want to be accompanied by a caregiver all the time. So, and I wanted, if this also points to power relations between researchers and respondents, and if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, with the latter, I don't think it has a lot to do with that because these questions are all asked in the context of a web app that's completed without a researcher present. It's a private thing done by the care partner and the person living with dementia. So the researcher is not present, and people living with dementia in this group, people with mild Alzheimer's disease, tended to forget details of the app. So I don't think that the researcher's presence was first and foremost in their mind, but so it's a small sample. We were really interested in whether or not, greater concern for safety would impact these technology preferences. And one limitation also is that there wasn't a lot of variation. Everybody rated all of these values fairly highly. Privacy was the least highly rated, but it was still, very highly rated. And so lack of variation could contribute to our lack of finding about a correlation. But I think to your point, previous work has found that people have different ideas of privacy, that absolutely these values are contextualized, and within the dynamics of that particular care partnership, maybe if somebody's spouse knows something about them, they don't believe that has anything to do with their privacy because of that particular relationship. So yeah, and we wanted to know this, and I am aware of other interventions under development where they assess values and then point to technologies that should be used. And I think maybe that might not be the right approach. That we might actually need to enable people to have the conversations about the technologies.
Thank you. Then we have a question online by Gerd Fischer.
Well, you know, I am always amazed listening to your talk, hearing hearing lots of exciting ideas, seeing many references. But at the same time, I think we are lacking sort of the interdisciplinary nature, which in my mind is a necessity. And I come out more of the AI, HCI camp, in particularly at the University of Washington. I have been there, in their iSchool does a lot of research, and I think you mentioned one person with whom you collaborated. So I think you would be in an environment where there are interesting constituencies to work together in interdisciplinary relationship, and maybe one could look whether at whether in human-computer interaction. I think there are actually quite a few, if you go to a CHI conference, quite a few articles addressing issues related to this. But so do you feel that this is an interest from your side to get new collaborations going, where you influence the people in the iSchool to design the next generation of assistive technologies, and how they can incorporate your data into their future designs, and you can look in return on their future designs and say, oh, that is a good direction, but it doesn't capture what I find out. So how do you think about the possibilities and maybe the necessities for this interdisciplinary collaboration?
That's a great question. And you're right, the UW is known for its faculty in the iSchool and human-computer interaction. They have a strong presence at CHI. There is a bit of a challenge in getting people engaged in aging technology development specifically. But I have worked with Batya Friedman, who developed value-sensitive design, consulted on my intervention generously. And I see a lot of potential to do more collaborative work with these folks here at the UW. Just this year, I started to turn to focusing on writing for a design audience, a HCI audience. And so we have a piece in, I got my fellow health sciences and social sciences folks here at the university in neurology, in public health, and in nursing to do some writing to encourage HCI researchers, more HCI researchers. I know there is a strong contingent of critical dementia design folks to turn towards dementia, to take it more seriously, and to really apply their creative lens to these kinds of interventions. And I'm seeing more work, Lisa Freak, for example, around privacy, older adults' privacy preferences. And I absolutely believe that it requires interdisciplinary work. I mean, I'm very limited in terms of, okay, now how do we translate this into actual design? What are the capacities of the technology? So yes, I foresee more interactive or more interdisciplinary collaborations. And I think it's absolutely critical.
Yeah, so if I could make one more short remark. So I would like to encourage you, you say there's not too much work in the CHI or HCI community. I would like to encourage you to try to publish a paper there. And I think this community would be grateful to you that you bring in a slightly different perspective and initiate a dialogue. If I could follow all your references, CHI, you mentioned, I think you published something in Design of Interactive System, which is another conference where people talk a lot about design activities. But in some ways, or let me ask this as a question, what have you ever published in CHI? Would you find it worthwhile to publish in CHI? Because my recommendation is the CHI community would embrace your ideas.
Thank you. That's I have just begun to think about focusing efforts on Kai, and one of the people I wrote with for the DIS paper we just published this spring, that was sort of, my foray into this field, Amanda Lazar's work, and I would actually point others to her work, who's solidly in bioinformatics and design at the University of Maryland, and has been, from my perspective, and it may be wrong because it's not my field, doing a lot of leadership and pushing the focus on dementia in spaces like Kai, and who has the design know-how and the tech know-how to build really interesting systems. So Amanda Lazar is somebody I recommend to folks. But yes, I am increasingly reading in that field and thinking about what could I offer that hasn't already been said by some of these wonderful folks who are focusing I find that the papers on dementia in that space, they're either, some of the papers are a little bit problematic and ableist, but the newer papers, I think, are very insightful. They do very attentive research with people living with dementia. It's really impressive, very careful, very thoughtful work. So I would be excited to interact more with those people. Thanks for that recommendation.
Because you're running out of time, unfortunately, so we have one last short question by Olga. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Clara, for your presentation. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Is that okay? My question goes back, or my comment goes back to, I think someone already raised it in the audience, the discrepancy between the value statements and the willingness to use technology, that the discrepancy that you mentioned. And I think one of the main problems is the information level, that people are not necessarily aware who gets the data, for people who say they value their privacy, and then they have Alexa in their living room, bedroom, kitchen, and so on, which is a bit of a contrast there, or like the problem there, because then we're not even aware what does that mean to have an Alexa or any technology in our homes, and who gets the data and what is being done with it. So I think my question is just, how can we increase the knowledge, or to make people more aware of different technologies and what it actually means to have those in their homes, and to have more to increase the awareness in the public, and also with caregivers and people with dementia. Just maybe to everyone, how we can move that forward to actually increase that knowledge, to be aware.
That's a great question. Am I hearing echo, or is somebody else speaking? Echo, okay. So wonderful question. And I think, obviously that's needed for the general population as well, but, research on algorithmic awareness shows that older adults are less aware of data flows and how algorithms work. And that also breaks down by certain marginalized groups, by race, by socioeconomic status, by disability status. And so I think focusing efforts on folks who are, based on surveys, least algorithmically aware, less aware of data flows, I think would be important. For older adults specifically, in the US, I would think that the groups that could be responsible for taking that kind of education on might be AARP, political advocacy groups for older adults, senior centers. So here we have this in the Older Americans Act, which funnels money down to localities from the federal government. So there are these touch points where people trust, they're using services. And I think those are spaces where there could be increased programming. We have a group in the US, actually, I think they've gone international, OATS, Older Adult Technology, I forget what the S stands for, but it's a peer-to-peer education program that has been found to be very effective. So people are less intimidated to have conversations and ask their questions and get them answered. And I think there are ways of communicating tailored to the way older adults, and older adults are very diverse. So different types of older adults want to learn about that information and can access it. I think it's really important. We're not going to find, the tech companies aren't going to do that for us. So.
thank you very much. Thanks for discussion and best wishes to Seattle. And a good day there. And I think we close here because time is up. And thank you.
So for our external guests, so to say, so we have here now a kind of social event, and unfortunately this is only available for persons in presence, but we are looking forward for those who can make it possible to see you again tomorrow morning at 9:30 in presence and online.